Okay, so thanks everyone for your patience. Sorry for the never-ending technical issues we've had throughout this workshop. We now have the internet, the streaming working, and the electricity is working, so normally it should be fine. We'll have to make a few adjustments just to make sure we don't go beyond the time limit. So basically, the talks in this session will be a bit shorter than yesterday. I think I mean, we discussed this with Chris and Enzo. So around 30 minutes talk and 15 minutes Q&A. And with the time we have left, so we'll try to keep the one coffee break after my talk to very, very short time, if that's okay with you guys. And then in the time we have left, because we have only short Q&As, we'll have a kind of panel discussion where the three of us will come back and we can have further discussions and you can ask further questions. All right, so the talks, so this morning is also an all ALIUS panel. This is very nice. Enzo is newly have joined ALIUS recently, and Chris has been in ALIUS since almost the beginning. And there's also a very kind of coherent, I think, story that we're going to tell, because my talk is going to have references kind of to the methodologies and issues that both Enzo and Chris will be speaking about later. So I've titled my talk Multidimensional Approaches to Consciousness, but I could have titled it Global States of Consciousness or Mapping Out Consciousness. So I'm going to be, broadly speaking, I'm talking about multidimensional approaches, but I'm going to be targeting specifically the notion of a global state of consciousness and asking what it means to try to map out the state space of phenomenal states and how, okay, and how we can do that. All right. So I'm going to finish with a few. Okay, yeah. I'm going to. Oh, it's the. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. There we go. I think it was slightly. You should be good now. Yeah. Okay, great. I'm just going to go back into the full screen mode. Okay, sorry about this. Hopefully this is the last time we have to fickle with this. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about basically I'm going to suggest that there are two ways to understand the notion of a global state of consciousness. One is the notion of a mode of consciousness that Matthieu has already talked about yesterday. And then I'm gonna suggest that there's another way to talk about this notion. Okay, so traditionally, philosophical interest in consciousness has tended to focus on what's sometimes called local states or specific states of consciousness, what is also often called conscious contents, with the idea usually that these local or specific states are individuated by their representational content. So examples would be experiencing pain, seeing a sunset, smelling crushed mint leaves, all of these kind of specific experiences that you might have. In this, okay, we have to relaunch the stream one last time. Are we good now? Okay, I'll just assume that it's working. And all right, so in the scientific literature, by contrast, and especially in the clinical neurological literature, there has been a tendency to focus on what's been called global states of consciousness. The notion kind of appeared in the 90s. Dave Chalmers in philosophy has kind of talked about these things by calling them background states of consciousness. And the traditional picture of global states of consciousness discriminates between different physiological states, global physiological states like wakefulness, sleep, and coma. So the idea is instead of focusing on specific contents, what you're conscious of, you're focusing on different ways to be conscious, right? So this is what Matthieu has talked about yesterday. And the traditional pictures from clinical, the clinical literature that has been put forward by Loris, among other people, is that global states are typically discriminated as regions in a two-dimensional space. One of the dimensions here would be what they call awareness, which pertains specifically to conscious content and to the range of conscious content that can be experienced in these states. So you can think of this as the bandwidth of consciousness. And the other dimension is called wakefulness or arousal, or sometimes levels of consciousness, and this is a much more kind of a fuzzy notion. Kind of intuitive idea being that it's a physiological or behavioral scale, but there are lots of issues around how to understand the notion of arousal. It has different definitions, and same for wakefulness. So this kind of traditional picture has come under criticism, especially from philosophers, because of somewhat loose and ambiguous definitions of the different constructs and dimensions. But the intuitive idea is that we start with examples, like the prima facie difference between coma and REM sleep and conscious wakefulness, ordinary wakefulness, and minimally conscious states. We start with these different examples, and we start from there to kind of build a model that explains what's different between these different examples, different global states. So recently, this is something that echoes what Matthieu has already talked about. Recently, there has been a new philosophical interest in global states of consciousness, and Tim Bain and Jacob Harvey in particular have called them, rebaptized them modes of consciousness, which I think is a better term for the reasons I will explain in a second. So ways of being conscious, and they have also suggested that these modes of consciousness actually shouldn't be mapped out on a simply two-dimensional space, because especially they've argued against this notion of levels of consciousness, right? So they can be ordered along a linear scale as you know, more or less conscious, or creatures can be more or less conscious depending on where they fit in this on this dimension. So they have suggested that instead they are differentiated by several dimensions, and they're not super committed about what exactly are the dimensions, but I will come back to that in a second. And just to give you further putative examples of modes of consciousness, so unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, which used to be called the vegetative states, minimally conscious state, emerged from minimally conscious state, which now the clinical literature suggests that is a distinct global state or mode of consciousness. REM dreaming, rapid eye movement dreaming, ordinary wakeful state, and recently Tim Bain and Oliver Carter have been suggesting that the psychedelic state is also a kind of a wholly different mode of consciousness. And so they suggest they propose a few different criteria for differentiating different modes of consciousness, and these are all kind of, they're not committed to any of those, but they just put them out there. So you could have content-based criteria, so you can ask, again, what's the bandwidth of consciousness? You can ask what kinds of content can and cannot be represented in specific modes. Then you can have criteria that pertain to the structure of consciousness, so temporal structure, what is the duration of the species present, so like the kind of temporal window of the present moment, or how is attention distributed and controlled, and finally functional criterion, so the idea being to what consuming systems are conscious content available or accessible. So this is kind of the classic notion of access consciousness that is very prominent in scientific models of consciousness. Consuming system being, for example, behavioral systems or you know, verbal systems to make verbal reports and this kind of thing. However, they don't have any real commitment on what the actual dimensions are, and they remain a little bit non-committal and slightly, well, I guess just neutral and agnostic about, you know, how we should actually go about to differentiate modes of consciousness. What's important, I think, is that modes of consciousness are mostly characterized, as the name suggests, which is why I think it's better than global state of consciousness, in modal terms. In other words, it's asking how many features can be represented in a mode, what kind of content can be represented, what kind of consuming system can access those contents. So it's always about possibility, right? So kind of, you know, if you want an analogy, kind of like different modes of a camera, the modes, you know, standby mode or a recording mode or low light mode, whatever. These modes determine what kind of function can be performed by a system. And the implication is that two creators A and B can be in the same mode of consciousness at a given time, even if what it's like to be A at this time differs from what it's like to be B at this time. So for example, two humans dreaming, in rapid eye movement dreaming, could have different contents. They could be dreaming about different things. They will still be in the same mode of consciousness according to this picture. So to quote Bain in an early commentary on this notion in his book on the unity of consciousness, regions, so modes of consciousness are regions in a complex state space, the parameters of which determine both the selection and functional roles of the subject's specific conscious states or contents. All right. So I think, and this is something that's been less discussed, the notion of global state of consciousness evokes another non-modal reading that has attracted less attention, namely the question of what is the overall experience of a creature at a given time. And if you contrast global states with local states or specific states or conscious contents, I think this reading makes, if you have this kind of contrast, it makes even more sense than the modes of consciousness notion. This kind of, I think, the kind of intuitive way to understand the notion of a global state versus a local state. So the idea would be that we have two different notions of global states of consciousness, the modes of consciousness that I've just talked about, characterized in modal terms, and what I call global phenomenal states, which are characterized in combinatorial terms, so as combinations of conscious contents at a given time. So you can think of global phenomenal states as snapshots of a possible subject's stream of consciousness or phenomenal field, as some people have said. And the idea is that global phenomenal states are not characterized in functional terms, but in terms of what it's like to be a subject at a given time. And this is typically elucidated in terms of representational contents as for local states. And so they are also not characterized in modal terms like on a réglé le problème là, finalement. So a global phenomenal state is not characterized in modal terms, but as a specific combination of conscious contents, right? So the idea is that you have your kind of phenomenal field or stream of consciousness, and you can have several specific contents at a given time. Maybe you have olfactory experience, an olfactory experience. You can see something. You can have thoughts, sounds, body sensations, emotions, pleasures, pains, time, sense of duration, maybe a sense of self. All of these things being specific kind of phenomenal properties or specific conscious contents, and what we trying to target when we talk about global phenomenal states is the whole thing, right? The whole snapshot of your stream of consciousness at time t. And I think that's another intuitive way to understand the notion of a global state of consciousness that's quite different from the notion of a mode of consciousness. Because remember, two people can be in the same mode without being in the same global phenomenal state. Two people dreaming can have different global phenomenal states. Okay, so when we talk about modes, we don't have, as I've just said, there is no agreement on the taxonomy of modes. There are lots of disputes. We don't know how many dimensions we should use to plot modes of consciousness. What are the different dimensions? Are they content-based, structural, functional? And so I will, instead of focusing on modes, here I will focus on global phenomenal states and on the project of mapping out actual and possible combinations of conscious contents. So when I use the notion of possible, especially biological possibility here, I'm taking inspiration from the notion of biological necessity that was put forward by Tim Bain. But essentially, a biologically possible feature is a feature compatible with the biological design specifications of human beings. So given the kind of biological design specifications of human being, what is kind of the kind of possible combination of conscious contents forming global phenomenal states, right? So first of all, I think we have to pay attention to the fact that global phenomenal states can be described at several levels of granularity or specification. So compare being at time t, having a perceptual experience, and having an algorithmic experience, so pleasure or pain. That's a very, very general level of description, right? So I can see a table and feel pain at the same time, but one way to describe this is just to say, at time t, I have a perceptual phenomenology and algorithmic phenomenology. A more specific way to say this is to say, at time t, I see red and I feel pain. That's really more specific. And yet, more specific would be to refer to very specific phenomenal property that I'm numbering here. So I see a particular quality of a particular shade of red, so like red 20, call it red 25, and particular quality of a particular type of pain, so let's say pain 12, right? So you have this kind of hierarchical structure in phenomenology, and you can describe global phenomenal space at different levels of granularity. So I think one way to think about this, and I think Ura Kriegel has talked about this very nicely in his book on the varieties of consciousness. Phenomenology is structured by two different types of relations: grounding relations and determinability relations. I'm not going to spend too much time on the grounding relations, but the idea is that some phenomenal properties can be reducible to others, to a combination of others, and other phenomenal properties are primitive. So, for example, Kriegel thinks that emotional phenomenology is reducible to a combination of cognitive phenomenology, so the phenomenology of thought, and conative phenomenology, so the phenomenology of desire. You can have other views about what emotional phenomenology is, but the idea is that some kinds of phenomenology that we talk about are actually a combination of two other more primitive kinds of phenomenology. And that's one way to think about the structuring relationships, structuring phenomenology. The one I'm going to focus more about is on the determinable-determinate relations. So think about the concept of color, of the property of being colorful. We say, usually in philosophy of language and metaphysics, that being colorful is a determinable of being red. And being red is a determinant of being colorful. Because being red is one way of being colorful, and it's kind of a more specific property. And so you can have the same kind of determinable-determinate relationships structuring the phenomenology. So most phenomenal properties are both phenomenal determinants of higher level phenomenal determinables. At the same time, there are also phenomenal determinables of lower level phenomenal determinants. So I'm going to illustrate this very quickly with what we can call the tree of phenomenal determinability. So at the highest level, you would have the highest phenomenal determinable, which is just phenomenality per se, right? So completely indiscriminate, just saying like if you're looking at this level of description, every global state of consciousness is the same with respect to this layer, because every global state of consciousness is, every global phenomenal state is a conscious state, so involves phenomenality per se, right? And then you can get more specific. At every layer of the tree, you get more and more determinate phenomenal properties as you get more and more specific. Is that clear? So just to give you a toy example, if you take a toy example with just two kinds of phenomenology, perceptual and algedonic, at the higher level you would have of description, you just have phenomenality per se. At the second layer, you'd have perceptual phenomenology and algedonic phenomenology. Each of them are determinable of determinates, like red and seeing red, seeing blue, being in pain, being in pleasure. And then you can go further down in the tree until you reach more and more determinate phenomenal properties. And the idea that Kriegel plays around with is that maybe there is also a bottom layer, maximally determinate phenomenal properties. This is more controversial. Actually, if you look at the first introspectionist psychologists like Wundt, they had also this idea that there are what they call the elements of consciousness, so the maximally determinate phenomenal properties. I'm not committed to that claim, so it's actually relevant to my project, but I think it's an interesting question to ask. Okay, and so the idea that a given global state of consciousness can be described at each layer of the tree, right? So, as I said, you can say that someone's given experience at a time involves just perceptual phenomenology and algorithmic phenomenology. That's very vague. It doesn't say much about what they're feeling. You could be more specific and say that they feel red and pain. You can be even more specific and they say that they feel a specific kind of red and specific kind of pain, right? So you can go down the tree and you can describe the global phenomenal state of a creature at all of these different layers, depending on the granularity you're targeting. Okay, so given that kind of approach to global phenomenal states, I think you can think of what I call the phenomenal state space, which is the space of all possible combinations of phenomenal primitives at any given layer. So you take a layer of the tree, and you think, what are the biologically possible combinations of these primitive phenomenal properties at this layer? And the idea is kind of a toy representation, a kind of two-dimensional reduction of this space. As you go further down the tree, you get more and more specific, and you get more and more possible combinations, right? So you can think of each of these square as a possible combination. The heat map would be, I'll come back to this, but maybe the intensity of each, or maybe the salience, maybe the attentional focus of each property. No, sorry, that's not what I meant. So the heat maps here, sorry, would be more rather, because each square is a possible phenomenal state. The heat map would be rather here the frequency of these phenomenal states, or their probability in experience. So there are regions of this space in which we are often, right? So for example, maybe the ordinary wakefulness stays usually in this region, right? Because the range of things we experience in ordinary wakefulness is restricted. Maybe in other altered states, in some altered states, maybe when you take psychedelics, for example, you start exploring all the regions of this phenomenal state space. I'll come back to that. But the idea is that the phenomenal state space itself can be described at several levels of granularity depending on what layer of the tree you're looking at. And the idea of the dimensionality of the space, and the number of dimensions you have in that space, is determined by the number of determinates at the chosen layer, so the number of circles here, right? So the idea is that this is a multidimensional model of consciousness where each node in the tree is a different dimension. So the further gone you go in the tree, the further specific you are, the more dimensions you have. Is that clear? Okay. So, right, I'm not going to be too long. So there are a number of open questions about thinking when you think about global phenomenal states like this and the phenomenal state space. As I mentioned, it's not obvious that you can have one-to-one or one-to-many mappings between the phenomenal state space and the modal state space, so the space of modes of consciousness, right? So, as I said, when you're dreaming, presumably you can have, clearly you can be in different global phenomenal states, right? So you can have a dreaming that you're running in a field, or you can dream that you're swimming in a lake, and these involve different global phenomenal states. But that doesn't mean that you don't remain in the same general region of the phenomenal state space. So it's an open question. But I don't see any reason. I kind of agree with Tim Bain and Jakob Horry on this. I don't think you should necessarily, you can completely discriminate between different modes just by talking about the contents, the conscious contents, right? So it's not clear that you have obvious mappings here, but it's an open question. Another nice question to think about when you're talking about the phenomenal state space is trying to find structural or necessary features of consciousness, if there are any. So the idea is that maybe at some level of granularity in the tree, you have a property that is present in all biologically possible combinations. In all the whole phenomenal state space involve this property. So in other words, this is a phenomenal property that's always present when you're conscious, at least in biologically possible cases. So, some people think that the sense of duration is like that. Some people think even that there's a form of self-consciousness that is like that, such that you cannot be in any state of consciousness without having that particular phenomenal property. And then you can also ask whether certain features and properties that are ubiquitous in ordinary experience can actually go missing when you explore foreign regions of the space, right? So let's say that in ordinary experience we stay within the red regions here, the most frequent regions of the phenomenal state space. Maybe if you start getting in very altered states of consciousness, we've heard about such altered states yesterday, but maybe if you if you go to a possession ritual and you get in a very altered state, where you take psychedelics or you meditate, maybe you can start exploring more foreign regions of the space where you realize that some of the things that are constantly present in your ordinary experience are missing. And that's also an interesting question. And the last question that's interesting to think about is the mapping problem. So what Chalmers has called the mapping problem, what Anil Seth likes to call provocatively the real problem of consciousness, namely mapping phenomenal states to neural states. The idea is that you can either try to have mappings at the level of specific contents, local states, so you can map a specific experience of tasting crushed mint leaves to a specific local brain state, or you could map global phenomenal states with either local or global brain states. But you can have questions about the mapping problem at the level of global phenomenal states instead of at the level of very specific experiences. And actually, if you kind of have a holistic position on this and you think that experiencing the taste of crushed mint leaves in combination with seeing a table, in combination with feeling pain or whatever, that you have to take the whole phenomenal states, global phenomenal states, and correlate it to something in the brain, but you can't actually pick apart the different properties and correlate them to specific brain states. So, I mean, that's a very controversial view that I'm not committed to, but maybe one reason for looking at global phenomenal states is that you might want to have a holistic position on the mapping problem. Okay, so now I'm going to talk in the time that I have left, which is about 10 minutes, a little less than that, about the some possible methodologies to investigate global phenomenal states and kind of trying to map out the phenomenal state space, right? So I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to do that. There are more, but one way would be to try to create new questionnaires that are more adequate to kind of capture the richness of global phenomenal states at different layers of granularity. Second thing I'm going to talk about is using natural language processing with large corpora of narrative reports. This is what also Enzo will talk about later. I will briefly mention my own research on this. And then I'm going to talk about using specific interview techniques to also try to probe into the experience of a subject. So if you look at the questionnaires that I typically use to capture the experience of people in altered states of consciousness, this is from Chris's DMT study that he will mention as well. This is the kind of standard questionnaire that is used, the so-called altered states of consciousness questionnaire. I think it's quite an old questionnaire. I mean, it's several decades old, and I think it's kind of starting to get kind of outdated because it doesn't capture the full spectrum of full richness of what people experience. These are the principal dimensions of the questionnaire. If you do factor analysis, the main factors, this has been psychometrically validated. I don't think psychometric validation is the alpha and omega of questionnaire validity. I think even questionnaires that are psychometrically valid, where the factors have that convergent and discriminant validity, can be flawed in many ways, and we don't really have time to get into this, but I think at the very least, this kind of questionnaire can leave out many aspects of the experience of participants. So one project would be to choose to pick a adequate level of granularity, so adequate layer of the tree of determinability, and devise a questionnaire that targets this layer, essentially by targeting, and this is obviously an idealization, but ideally what you want to do is target each of the different phenomenal primitives at this layer, right? With having at least one item for each of them, maybe several items, right? And have subjects rate these different items. My hypothesis is that the further down you go in this tree, the further unreliable introspection becomes, right? Because as you get more specific in terms of did you experience red 25 or red 12, right? It gets increasingly intractable. I think the goal here would be to find a middle ground between generality, because if you stay at the first layer, it's very uninteresting. As you say, like, the question is, do you have a visual experience right now? Well, the answer is kind of obviously yes, but that doesn't say much, right? So you want to get to a suitable level of specificity, but also trying to find the sweet spot, not get too far down the tree, because otherwise your answers are going to be very unreliable. So that's one way to go about this. The second methodology I want to discuss is using machine learning algorithms, specifically natural language processing algorithms, to try to map out the phenomenal state space described in specific corpora of narrative reports. So here I'm focusing on something I've been doing with an online database of so-called trip reports called errorrate.org. So that basically people taking drugs and reporting their experience on the drug-induced states. This is also what Enzo is going to be speaking about. So we've each have parallel projects on this using different techniques, but I've been looking at about 15,500 trip reports tagged with drug names, and I've been using a technique called document embedding that essentially turns each word in the corpus and each drug tag into a vector in a high-dimensional vector space. So the training involves randomly sampling consecutive words from the same drug documents, from trip reports for the same drug, and predicting a center word from a randomly sampled set of words by taking as input the context words, the words around this word you have to predict, but also the drug tag, so what drug was used. And in this context, the drug tag acts as a kind of a memory for the context that's missing from the specific sample of a few words that you're looking at. So the model is looking at when training every time. So you pass through the documents multiple times like this, and you train the vectors, and eventually you reach a pretty good model that captures with this vector space the kind of semantic contents of different words, but also the kind of average semantic contents of all the descriptions of LSD experiences, for example. I'm going to be more specific to explain what that means. So one question you can ask with the kind of model is what are the top ends, for example, the top 100 closest word vectors to a given drug vector? And what this means is that you can try to estimate the location of phenomenal states induced by LSD, for example, within the phenomenal state space. So I'm going to give you a few preliminary results from this ongoing study. It's something that's been going on forever. I started working on this in 2016, but because it's been a side project for so long, because this is not my main research, the paper is still not ready, but hopefully one day it will be. So here are preliminary results with yet for now it's not an optimal model, but we're getting there. So you can kind of get a snapshot. This is what we call a concept cloud, which is kind of capturing the closest word vectors to a drug vector. You kind of get a snapshot of the effects described on error rates for specific drugs. This is, for example, for 2CI and psilocybin. Here for DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT, getting work quite nicely. And here for salvia and datura, so less pleasant drugs. And in some cases very unpleasant if you look at the reports. And you can actually get and again, this is not yet the optimal model. What we're going to do to find the optimal model is we're going to turn each model into a classifier and feed the classifier new unseen documents and see how well it does at predicting what drug was used. And then we'll use the optimal model for the published paper. But it performs rather well at kind of giving us a snapshot of the main effects of different drugs. And there is a question at what level of granularity. I mean, it's not clear here, like you're kind of collapsing the different layers of the tree. So it's not clear if you're looking at the same layer or not. But it's one technique that you can look at. Another thing you can do with this kind of model is estimate the phenomenal similarity between the average state produced by two different drugs. So you can ask the question, looking at how close two drug vectors are in the space, like you can look at the Euclidean distance between two vectors, you can ask how similar is the average experience with DMT from the average experience with LSD, for example. And I think you're going to talk about this as well and those things. Yeah. So here is what we've been playing around with this, and here is what you can get, a kind of a cluster map of which compares all the main drugs described on error rate with all the other drugs. And this is a color coding based on the kind of broad neuropharmacological categories of the different drugs. As you can see, if you look at the colors of how the drugs have been classified by the model by looking at the distance between the vectors, it performs quite well at grouping together drugs that actually belong together, right? So if you look at in red, you have psychedelic drugs. You see that the model clusters them all together quite nicely. Even if the model doesn't know what drug was taken, the model is just looking at the words used to describe the trips, right? And yet it does quite well. And the corpus is blinded for drug names and any kind of word that could give away the drug. I mean, you've done something, Enzo. It's a very long process. We have thousands of words that we have to remove. It's a very time-consuming process. But in the end, this is a pretty. It should be normally a pretty blinding model. So you see, it performs quite well. Okay, and the final thing we can do is use interviews and ask people directly what they've experienced. but you want to do that in a way that doesn't prime them, and doesn't prime them in particular to confabulate. And so what we've been using with Chris in the DMT study ongoing at Imperial, that he's going to be mentioning as well in his talk, is that we've been doing interviews. We're using this specific technique called the macrophenomenological interview, which is specifically designed to try to avoid confabulation and introspective biases, to try to probe into the experience. So it's post hoc. It's after people have been injected intravenously a high dose of DMT. Don't try this at home. And we ask them, we put them in right after this. So currently in the current phase of the study, they're having the DMT dose in an fMRI scanner combined with EEG. When they come down, we take them to another room. They lie down, they close their eyes, and then we start the interview for at least 1 hour, focusing on an experience that lasted 10 to 15 minutes. The DMT experience is very short. So we get some level of detail, right? And then you can actually, I'm not going to get into the details of the interview because I don't have time, but you can actually formalize the data and do kind of a comparison between what different people told you, analyze the data and kind of look at the average structure of the experience across participants. And for reasons that I don't really have time to explain here, maybe Chris, you'll get into that, I don't know, but we get actually a correlation between the objective time frame of the experience and the different phases of the description, what people tell us in the interviews. So we can actually, we have contextual anchors that allow us to have an almost minute by minute correlation, like essentially the interview data is time locked to the objective duration of the experience using contextual anchors. And this allows us to do this kind of nice graphs where you plot here is like the intensity of 3 different dimensions, visual and bodily and emotional, over time. And this is the average across 13 participants. So this is at the very high layer of the tree, right? Because it's only visual phenomenology, bodily phenomenology, and emotional phenomenology. But you can imagine in the future going more specific and plotting, going, 1 layer down, for example, and plotting more specific contents and how they dynamically vary in a specific state. So that's also says something about how you look at global phenomenal states, not just as a snapshot, but in time, if you had an additional dimension, which would be the dynamic evolution of the states through time. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop here because I don't have time for more. Thank you. Yeah.
Just a quick question. You mentioned Euclidean distance. It's not like angles more for what to take.
You can have several measures of the distance between two average vectors. There are other ways to do it, so I don't have them on top of my head. But I think the one that's most commonly used is cosine similarity. Yeah, cosine similarity. But you can. I think you can also use. So I'd have to ask to look up the details. Actually, I don't have them on top of my head. But you can do, for example, this kind of cluster map. You can do that using several distance metrics. And the one that works the best with Ward's method is using Euclidean distance. Okay. But you have different ways to do it.
Normalize it. You always have to understand or you do like a IDF transform or something like that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Euclidean distance.
Yeah. So you have at least 6 different methods you can use. But the best classification we've observed is with Euclidean distance and Ward's method. But I can send you. Yeah, I can send you that. Yeah. So question here and question here. So I don't know who was first.
Mine is short.
Okay, correct.
You've answered mine already. I have many questions about this because it's the stuff I work, but I would like to go more in the philosophical. Are you aware that you're making a deep statement about the cardinality of phenomenology
right.
base layer?
Right.
When you show those trees, because it could be that at the bottom layer there are finite number of nodes. So
that's right.
Finite. finite
Yeah.
number of nodes.
Yeah.
It could be that there are as many nodes as natural numbers.
Yeah.
But you put it yourself, paint 12, and
Yeah.
it could be that you are uncountable. So
Yeah.
as many, and
Yeah.
then you cannot draw the tree.
Yeah. Well.
I think you cannot.
You can. I mean, it's if you're just talking about the bottom layer, that's okay, right? Because
if the bottom layer is in Aleph 1, I think you will be making a list of the phenomenal states, and if you make a list, it cannot be Aleph 1.
so
See my point?
what my point is that I'm not committed to saying that there are.
No, I know.
Right.
I'm wondering that.
But you could describe.
There are as many as natural numbers. It's okay. But there's as many as real
I see.
numbers.
I see.
The tree itself cannot be drawn, I think, because
That's not obvious to me, but I'd like to talk. Yeah, maybe we can talk about this later. But
we'll need a mathematician in the room. I studied mathematics for some time, so I have this feeling that you cannot do that.
Okay.
You will be
Interesting.
putting them in a list, and once you put them in the list, you map them into.
But you start from the bottom up, right? So you don't start from the. Sorry, you start from the top down, not from the bottom up.
Yeah, but these people, not you, but others are committed that the bottom layer exists. But if the bottom layer exists, and they are.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So what I'm saying is I'm not committed to that. So it doesn't change
I
anything.
would like to get in touch with those who believe that. Because
I see. Yeah.
It's dependent on whether they are uncountable or not.
Yeah. So if you want,
if you cannot draw the
yeah, I agree. So if you think there is a bottom layer, I agree. Yeah. But my point was precisely, it's irrelevant to my project whether or not there is a bottom layer. But that's nice. Yeah, that's a nice point. So we have David, and then I don't know, Christian, and that's why we need someone to chair these sessions. But yeah.
Thanks a lot. It was really inspiring, and especially like that natural language processing thing. I think it's really exciting and inspiring. But so I'm really curious about how you deal with the fact that people are talking about their experiences in those websites, for instance, that you are using to do your analysis. People are like telling their story, telling their experience in a really special way, which is quite influenced by the
Sure.
Or the time. For instance, like if you take like the LSD experience,
it
was probably not described in the same way in the 70s and now.
Yeah.
And especially like in those websites. It's not like any psychedelic user who are.
Of course.
It's like especially like it's a bit like about the weird problem in the experimental.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So
it's a different kind of weird people.
No, but I mean like
actually weird people.
Wait, also weird people.
So yeah. No,
the fact that people are not telling exactly what they feel.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think there are several things here, right? So I completely agree. First of all, there is a selection bias on Android for sure. Like it's like the kind of hippie Californian psychonauts. The website. Yeah, like you, Enzo. So there's people like Enzo. And we don't want to be sampling only people like Enzo. No offense, Enzo. No, but so yeah, I agree. And I think actually one of the next steps would be to have the successor to Aeroid, kind of working on that, but like there's a project on that, but having a website that's kind of more inclusive, because first of all, it doesn't look like it's straight from the 90s. It's less, Aeroid is very specific because it's very, very tied to the psychonaut community. I think you can have a website that's a little more neutral and maybe a little more inclusive of also, people who are from different populations and so on. What you say about the language used, I think it can mean two things, right? It can mean either that people are influenced by, there are two things. People can be influenced by cultural context, as you discussed in your talk. So maybe they're actually experiencing different things because, the setting in psychedelic drugs is very important. So they might be experiencing different things. And that's okay because what you're doing here is only probing the phenomenal state space. So it might be that you can take drugs and get into a different region of the space. But that's fine if you're still probing a certain region of the space, right? The bigger worry is that is only they're describing things in a different way. I think that's maybe a worry. I think it's partly mitigated because of the sheer sample size that we have here, 50,500 documents. The average drug study has like 12, 15, or 20 participants. It allows for to some extent, some variability. I mean, you can say they all belong to the same group, they all talk in the same way, and that's true to some extent, but there is still some variability in how people describe their experiences. And also, each of these words is actually not just a word, but a vector that captures the semantic content that you can probe. So I haven't shown this here, but I actually asked my model, what are the top 100 word vectors closest to the vector idea, and it would give me a list of all these words that lets me actually probe into the model and know what they mean when they say what the model captures by the notion of idea, right? So that's why we call this concept cloud and not word cloud, because actually each of these is a vector that captures a concept rather than just a single word. So it's much richer than just a word occurrence thing.
Because otherwise you would risk that finally it's not so much phenomenology, finally it would be like more like
yeah, of course.
All people talk about.
Which is why ultimately I think the microphonological interview is the best. But what you would want in an ideal world is having 15,000 interviews in control settings and use machine learning on this interview data. But that's not yet possible. Maybe in 1,000 years we'll have that data. But yeah. Do you have a question?
Thanks, Rafael. That was very interesting. I'm glad to see that you're moving away from the global local distinction.
Yes.
And using the language of modes of consciousness. But I'm afraid that the language of the way you structure that tree is still importing the global local distinction to the back door. So why not just say that the global states of consciousness, that if you want to retain that terminology, what characterizes them is sort of a level of cross-modal integration. So global states are cross-modal integrated versus the so-called local states, where the bottom states are less cross-modal integrated. So you can talk about, say, coherent versus diffuse cross-modal integration.
Yeah.
So really that way you're moving away from this sort of top-down, global, local. So what I would like to see is that the highest phenomenal determinant there is basically a bigger circle that basically contains the intermediate and the second layer. So that way you have a sort of one level versus a two-level or multi-level model, where what you have is sort of integration or coherence versus decoherence rather than sort of top-bottom, because there you're exposing yourself to some sort of a kind of infinite regress there. And where do you draw the line between, let's say, a vocabulary of phenomenal concepts versus getting into a vocabulary of, semantic primitives and so on? So,
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about the phenomenal concept. I think is it's one worry that Raya discusses in his book. Are we just talking about concepts? Are we talking about properties? So you're saying essentially, why don't we have a more like a concentric circle model kind of thing?
Or overlapping circles.
Yeah.
Or shortcuts across the same level.
Yeah. Well, I think this is not a worry I haven't talked much about this, but if you look at what Raya's project, for example, is a project of having also this grounding relations between different kinds of phenomenology, right? And the assumption here is that we're only looking at the primitives. So properties that are not grounded in a combination of other properties. But if you want to talk about cross-modal experiences, it's a controversial thing, right? But if there is such a thing as, maybe there is so if you want to say that the sum is greater than the parts in a cross-modal experience, then you might say it's a primitive phenomenology. If not, then it's just there is a grounding relation, the combination of two different kinds of phenomenology, say visual and auditory, yields the cross-modal property. But
what I want to say is that there are not so much different kinds of phenomenology, rather than we were to specify. So you talk about phenomenology,
right?
Color perception versus sound versus whatever.
Yeah.
So assuming that these are discrete phenomenologies, then we have the burden is on you to basically explain exactly how those phenomenologies integrate, what are their structural features or their overlapping features.
Okay.
So that way, you've got a little more explanatory work to do. That if you assume that there is some cross-modal integration, all we have to do is just articulate the different kinds of content that they are, the structural features, and you can draw more, lines of connection between what you call, the bottom layer and the layers of
okay.
and so on. And you don't really have to sort of
right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I mean, let's talk about this later. But it's not obvious to me that you'd have, or you should do that. But like we can talk about this later. Maybe I think we have to move on, unfortunately, and we'll try to have a conversation at the end. But thanks again, and we'll now move on to Chris's talk. We can have like a really 1 minute coffee break if you want, but we have to be really where we set things up.
So these trees come from the work of pain.
No, that's just the tree is me, but
But the core idea.
the core idea of the determinable determinants is from Recherche.
You can have primitives that prompts many. Many will be infinite. Aleph 1, Aleph 0.
But the bandwidth is always limited, right?
Yeah, but it's the same.
Merci Raphaël
tree
pour cette
depends
présentation.
on
Bien chouette. J'avais plusieurs commentaires, mais un rapidement, c'était sur la microphéno là.
Ouais.
Tiens, les microphéno.
Il faut juste que je mette le. Ouais, désolé, mais je t'écoute. Chris, do you have a USB key because it has to be on this computer?
I do not have a USB.
Okay, I have one, but do you have a USB port?
Yeah. I have an adapter for this.
No, it's not about that. It's about the live streaming.
Ah.
Yeah.
I have a USB key. Désolé, Oussama. Here.
Moi, j'étais surpris par l'hypothèse que la précision transmittive diminuerait sur l'échelle. C'est quand tu regardes un microphéno, tu fais exactement l'inverse. Pour éviter la confabulation, tu vas essayer d'amener la personne à décrire plus en détail.
Tu vas quand même du plus général au plus. Oui, mais
un risque de
enfin.
confabulation plus fort quand tu restes à un niveau de granularité trop élevé. Une des façons d'amener la personne à revivre l'expérience sans l'amener.
C'est vrai, t'as raison. Mais ça dépend, tu vois, si c'est la question, c'est est-ce que tu as eu une expérience visuelle ou pas. Clairement, n'importe qui peut dire de manière extrêmement fiable est-ce que j'ai eu une expérience visuelle ou pas.
Ça, je pense que c'est pas
mais je pense qu'il y a deux différents niveaux de généralité. Il y a généralité dans le discours qui peut être du coup une sorte de discours théorique, c'est ça que il faut éviter, quoi, le discours théorique sur son expérience. Mais si tu décris vraiment l'expérience, tu es vraiment en train de développer l'expérience, je pense que plus tu vas dans le détail, après, bon, je pourrais être clair, si c'est théorique, c'est que grâce à sa technique, tu peux éviter sur les déconfabulations. Mais je pense quand même qu'il y a un risque. Plus tu descends. Mais j'entends ce que tu dis, enfin, c'est vrai que c'est...
Donc il y a deux risques. Une autre façon de le dire, c'est qu'en fait il y a deux risques différents.
So it's this one, right?
Il y a le risque de confabulation et le risque d'imprécision.
Oui, voilà.
Au sens de uncertainty.
Ouais. C'est this one, right? No.
The one behind? No, not neither of those actually. That one. This one.
Okay, we'll start right away. 30 minutes for show and 50 minutes for running. We've lost
We
a
do
lot
like 40 and 5.
Okay, if you want.
Because I
don't
just
think
did
it's
too much slides.
Okay, then
But
it's up to you
I'll
if you
try.
prefer to have more feedback or... Wait, I'll just take off my key. It depends on like, how much feedback, how much discussion. I think we won't have a lot of time for the panel discussion here, but it's up to you. Okay. All right, everyone, we're gonna start again because we have to keep moving forward.
Center for Interaction
So it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Zimmerman from Imperial College London, who has been a member of ALIUS for quite some time now, and who's going to talk to us about novel opportunities in the bridging of first-person reports and neuronal activity in transitions of consciousness.
Cool. So within the context of this specific the specific panel, I thought it was a good opportunity to try to look at the things that I've been doing in the research that we've been conducting at Imperial, specifically at my PhD project, in which we're administering DMT, a very potent in terms of psychological effects, a potent psychedelic substance. And how can we, it's an opportunity in a way, how can we fit what we're doing into methodologies, second-person methodologies? So the idea of bridging first-person and third-person data on that. And just as a caveat, these ideas and also, you know, kind of like what we can take out of this, or what I can take out of it, I think in terms of also asking new empirical questions and issues, are not completely fleshed out at the moment. So it may be a bit scattered, but we'll see how it goes. So I'd like to start with this idea of overlaps in non-ordinary states of consciousness. The fact that we are seeing a lot of similarities between different states of consciousness, and how can we better tease apart the similarities, the overlaps, and the differences, and what that tells us about the current models and theories of consciousness in some sort of way. So, for example, the psychedelic state has been compared to dreaming, contemplative practices, near-death experiences, temporal lobe epilepsy, psychosis, and I've even heard some suggestions on autism, that the autistic sort of state is similar to the experience of serotonergic psychedelics, right? My intuition in general is that this, you know, this idea of just collapsing different states of consciousness comes also from rudimentary theories on conscious states, which fail to view kind of like the diversity in terms of phenomenal properties. So what does it feel like to be in each of these states? And these rudimentary models also responding to our rudimentary conceptualization of these marginal states of consciousness. So the fact that we're not visiting these states as much might be the reason of why we have this conceptualization that everything that's outside of a normative sort of state tends to be collapsed together. This is an intuition, of course, right? So, you know, very much based on what Raphael was mentioning, you know, new approaches and how can we characterize these different phenomenal properties using multidimensional approaches, you know, might be useful. And what I'm going to, so for example, in the psychedelic state, this sort of like multidimensional analysis has been recently applied by Tim Bain and Olivia Carter, in which they are still sticking to this kind of like functional approach. So how each of these different dimensions of experience in the psychedelic state can be enhanced or impaired in the psychedelic state. What I'm going to argue mostly in this in the talk here is what happens if we take a process-based approach, if we take temporality into account, and how these different dimensions change over time, and how that can maybe inform us a bit better on this idea of characterizing consciousness as what does it feel like to be in that state, right? So to start first with the idea of overlap, so this is a study done by Enzo, who's going to speak now, on the similarity between corpora of reports of dreams and psychedelics, psychedelic states, using natural language processing. And you know what he finds is that among psychoactive substances, deliriants and serotonergic hallucinogens shows the higher similarity. High lucidity dreams mapping out more strongly to serotonergic psychedelics, and low lucidity with deliriants. Right. Another example of overlap also coming this year was by Raphael on the similarity between psychedelics and meditation, and all the different varieties between those similarities, the extent of the overlap, and the differences between substances, and also how different doses can, you know, emulate or simulate different aspects of these experiences. And also this year, a questionnaire study in which we published on the similarities between DMT state induced in the lab with near-death experiences. So we compared people undergoing actual near-death experiences with DMT-induced near-death experiences or something of the sort. And yeah, when I was crafting this bunch of slides, I realized that, yeah, everyone in this panel actually did something of the sort this year. And also on this near-death experience study, we see that not only the acute effects, we see like an overlap using the specific questionnaire, which is a very gross way of trying to map out phenomenology, but we also see that contextual variables play a similar role for people reporting the extent of these experiences, both in near-death experiences and in the psychedelic state. And these contextual variables refer mostly to personality variables such as absorption or delusional beliefs, or what has been labeled as delusional beliefs. So, right, so second person approaches. I'm going to do a brief sort of overview on how second person approaches, what they broadly are, at least the ones that we've been using in the context of DMT study, and how they have been used in other studies, also involving biological data as well. So the idea comes from this, the conceptualization of neurophenomenology proposed by Francisco Varela, in which when we try to account for first-person reports and third-person data, usually biological data, we need to find a second-person approach, a middle sort of way in which first-person and third-person data are mutually constraining each other, which would be the ideal way in which we can explore the issue of consciousness in a disciplined fashion with proper empirical questions and so on. And one implementation of this is microphenomenology, so what Raphael spoke about in his previous talk, and the idea that we can map out both dichronic and synchronic elements in the experience. So we can include this temporal element into the description of experiences, and also the multidimensional aspects of the progression of the experience. Right, so this is one example that came out last year on meditation using microphenomenological interviews. So they take, they do the specific way of doing this interview, which follows kind of like a specific procedure. And then they apply different methods to analyze the data. Some of them are qualitative or mixed methods, such as coding systems, which are then mapped out into, so they take, for example, the different colors that people associate to different types of meditation and the different body parts to that. And also quantitative, more sort of like objective analysis, like psycholinguistic analysis. But if we go also way back and we look at research on hypnagogic imagery, we also find that they kind of use a proto-microphenomenological interview approach. So if you look at this interview right here, by a classic study by Folks and Vogel, you can see how there's an exploration of different sensory registers in the interview. There's an assessment of the temporality of that, and there's also an exploration on pre-reflective aspects of the experience. So aspects of the experience that are not immediately obvious for the person in this wake-sleep transition, right? And then they develop a coding system from these interviews, and they quantify the extent of these things. So within the second person approaches, one interesting thing that we can question about phenomenology and brain data is the idea of discontinuities or nonlinear transitions in time, right? So one way that we can think about this, and there's a bit of evidence showing that experience might not be a continuous process, but a discrete process in which different moments of experiences are sort of like, they're like blocks in time, and they do not follow kind of like a gradual continuous fashion. And that these blocks have different neuronal underpinnings. So this is an early example of that by Eugenio Rodriguez in the late 90s, in which he, by showing either images of faces or scrambled images, a measure of synchrony in the brain was associated to that. So there's this phase locking value, which is an EEG measure of synchronization, in which neural ensembles are associated to perceptual moments, which are then followed by phase scattering, so the loss of synchronization after these moments of emergence, right? Similarly, Antoine Lutz, using sort of like a similar approach, but incorporating microphenomenology to really probe into the readiness or unreadiness to perceive a certain object, also tries to disentangle these properties of synchrony and scattering, possibly accounting for different perceptual moments, discrete moments of perception. Right. Another discontinuity, and this is also something that we can try to like empirically test, is how some pharmacological perturbations can induce very strong discontinuities in terms of experience. So, for example, in the case of DMT, when we look at the phenomenology and we look at some of the instruments that we use to probe into that phenomenology, we see that there's a massive discontinuation in experience, and that massive discontinuation in experience generates to or relates to this idea in which people feel that they're disembodied, but nonetheless, and they go somewhere else, but nonetheless have strong visual imagery, strong sense of visual hallucinations. So large richness of experience, if you will, but at the same time a strong dissociation of the sensory motor coupling with the external environment. So a way that we can think about it is this kind of like the induction of a world analog, a virtual space in which the system is detached from sensory input. And this is kind of like very similar to this idea of dreaming, and dreaming in which experience is not constrained by bottom-up sensory activity coming in, but is mostly determined by endogenous processes in the brain. So yeah, so this is our questionnaire in the DMT study, and these are these results from 13 participants, and you can see the highest rated items are these imagery components, hallucinations, and which are followed by disembodiment. So rich phenomenal experiences in a state of disconnection. But you know, when we look also at a recent study done by Claire Petit-Manjan on mind wandering, we also see similar sort of ideas of disconnection, a sense of disembodiment during the process of these microphenomenological interviews, probing into meditators when they lose that meditative state and they go into mind wandering. And they also very similarly describe this idea of disembodiment, but still phenomenal richness emerging. Right. And these are our specific phenomenological features in our studies, and we see that the strongest rated items in the DMT session is this idea of experiencing a different reality or dimension. So this idea that there's a non-linear process happening in experience in terms of phenomenal properties. Another way that we can think of these discontinuities is in the sense of image formation. So people are with their eyes closed in our experiments. They're having whatever experience they have in eyes closed. We administer the DMT, and then we see the emergence of a rich image. We can speculate that somehow these are also referring to discontinuities in experience and possibly nonlinear transitions in terms of brain states. We can also think not only of image formation, but we can think also in the transition from simple to complex imagery. So the idea that we go from simple geometrical patterns into more elaborate sort of imagery, and that this may have also very different neuronal underpinnings and neuronal dynamics. And we can maybe think about discontinuities here. And the same happening in terms of microdreams and the transition into these into this vivid visual imagery, or not necessarily vivid, but visual imagery in the onset of dreams. So the idea is that, so this is an example of this done by Tori Nielsen, in which he describes how different parts of the EEG are underpinned by different parts of the experience. So the onset of this visual experience marked first by some motor activity detected by the EEG, the synchronization of occipital alpha, and then when people are awake after this transition into microdreams, eye movement emerging, and the proper cue that the subject says by saying, "I've now woken up again." Again, the idea of discontinuity emerges in these transitions of consciousness. Another discontinuity that we can think about is this idea of sensing presences or entities in the DMT state. So the moment in which people are in the visual scene, they're in this geometrical space, they're seeing this complex imagery. When there's this strong sense of otherness emerging, intuitively we can say that there's a popping up in terms of experiential features that could be also mediated by neuronal activity. And this is some simple correlation analysis that we've done with the items of have you sensed a presence during your DMT experience and EEG activity, where we see reductions in certain frequency bands. So this is a very non-specific way to probe into this, and certainly not necessarily is a specific indication of the marking of sensing a presence in the DMT state. Right? And finally, in terms of discontinuities, we can try to probe into the mechanisms into discontinuity. So, for example, research done by Rufen van Roelen and others recently have associated that the window of perception, or temporal resolution, is mediated by certain features of the EEG. So we have this alpha wave, mostly that's very prominent in the back of our head, where visual information is processing. The basic idea is that you can probe the resolution of experience by presenting two successive flashes of light. So if you present the flashes of light in quick succession, like below 100 milliseconds, you will see them as a unitary percept. And if you go over this threshold broadly, you will see them as two flashes of light. The interesting thing is that there's some evidence showing that whether or not when you're at threshold at near 100 milliseconds, whether or not you perceive two flashes of light or one flash of light depends on the phase of the EEG. So what's the speed of the alpha power, right? The interesting thing with LSD, this idea that the sampling rate of the world increases, might be underpinned by the fact that the alpha band, as you can see there in the red line, the alpha speed is increased under LSD. So we can actually try to probe into this mechanism with proper empirical designs. All right, so now into the idea of having this temporal approach to understand experiences induced in the lab, or non-ordinary states of consciousness, and also brain states. What are the trajectories of both these levels in which we can collect data? So by having experimental manipulations, we can try to probe into how the system is massively perturbed by, for example, when we administer DMT, but not only the perturbation, and how the system then regains homeostasis, how the system is built back after the experience, right? And an ideal way to probe into this is DMT specifically, because it has a very short time of action. It's a very short duration compared to other serotonergic psychedelics. So we not only can we look at the perturbation in these two levels of data collection, but we can also try to map the trajectory of different dimensions of experience and how they change over time. So if we take, for example, a simple averaging approach, which is what we did with our EEG study at the beginning, and you look at what's happening at the average of 5 minutes after administering DMT, we see, this very massive reduction of alpha and some reductions in beta bands. So this dominant frequency of the brain, this alpha frequency of the brain. If we take a very simplistic way of interpreting this, and we can think of, well, alpha waves are underpinning an active disengagement from the environment. So alpha power becomes especially prominent when we're with our eyes closed in a relaxed state. Then this massive reduction corresponds to an active engagement with an environment or the virtual space. But this would be kind of like a very non-specific way to think about alpha, right? And again, when we take this broad averaging approach in terms of experience, and we look at these different dimensions of experience, people are answering, but there's no clear constraint on what point in time they're answering to each of these questions at. And how this gives us a clear picture of what is it to be in like that state is quite imprecise if we use this broad sort of averaging approach, right? So what we did is we used this very simple sort of like pharmacological approach in which we ask intensity ratings for people at each passing minute after administration. So in real time. So how intense is the experience from 0 to 10, 0 being non-intense at all, so no drug effects, and 10 being the highest possible imaginable effects. And what we see is that there's this very strong increase to peak effects between 2 and 3 minutes after administration, and there's a gradual decrease. And then we can look at what happens with our EEG measures, what we're measuring in the brains in terms of classical sort of like EEG frequency bands, brain waves, but also using complexity measures. And what we see is that when you look at this, so to the right you have the DMT spectrogram, you can see this very strong yellow line in the alpha band. The red line is the onset in which we administer the drug, and you see this massive dropout in the alpha band at the beginning of the experience, and then this gradual build up back again of this frequency band. And we see a very nice correlation between real-time intensity and the dropout of this alpha band, right? But not only that, by using this temporal approach, we also see a positive correlation with low frequency bands. And these low frequency bands are especially prominent during REM sleep. So not only during REM sleep, but also in microdreams or hypnagogic imagery, the amount of imagery incidence correlates very strongly to some of these increases in low frequency, these theta bands. Right? And this might inform on current ideas that theta, which has been associated to temporal lobes, might be related to some of the phenomenal experience of the psychedelic state. And this chimes kind of like also with very old research done in the 50s with implanted electrodes in temporal lobes in which visual imagery and phenomenal experience induced by LSD associated to these increases in theta. And this chimes into kind of like the theory of Robin Carhart Harris, my supervisor at Imperial, saying that the coupling from the temporal lobes to association cortices on theta waves may underpin different states of consciousness, such as dreaming, psychedelic imagery, acute psychosis, and temporal lobe epilepsy. Yeah. And also the importance of medial temporal lobes in dreaming, and specifically theta in medial temporal lobes in REM sleep. So we have some evidence for that. And the variability in medial temporal lobes in the hippocampi, as seen by Enzo in terms of blood and hemodynamic response variability. So in the variability of the brain response in these areas of the brain related to the administration of psilocybin, so in the psychedelic state. All right, let's skip that one. All right, so going back again to the DMT experiments, what we've been doing in terms of mapping this multidimensional space in time. So Raphael conducted some interviews in this pilot study in which using microphenomenological interviews, which were aided by acute recollection. So we basically used this, the intensity ratings from 0 to 10 people gave. And by using these intensity ratings, Raphael was able to conduct the interview and time stamp what was happening at different moments of experience with varying degrees of resolution, right? So mapping out a narrative, a temporal narrative of what's happening in the experience over time. So using this approach, Raphael then rated the intensity of common dimensions of experience across participants. So this was a proof of concept approach in which we basically said, well, let's just probe into what's common to every participant in a very gross fashion, and let's see where that takes us. So this is the coded intensity at each of these minutes of experience for these 3 dimensions. So the visual domain, a bodily domain, and an emotional metacognitive domain. And in the experience here, you can see strongly what we found in our data, that the bodily was the most significantly altered aspect of the experience at the beginning. And then we see a massive reduction. And this massive reduction possibly relating to this sense of disembodiment. As this massive reduction happens, the strong increase in visual imagery emerging. So again, the idea of generating this virtual space, this virtual scene, in a state of interrupting this sensory-motor loop mechanisms, possibly. The nice thing about this is that we can take these different aspects of experience and then we can correlate them with our EEG data. So when we did this analysis with visual imagery, we see the effects to different EEG measures that we're interested. So we see these increases in low frequency in delta, decreases in alpha and beta, and strong increases in complexity, this LEMPL-SIB, which I'm going to discuss in a bit now. And the nice thing about this is we can try to map out a multidimensional brain state as well about these experiences, right? So in bodily effects, we see that the low frequency increase is not present, but instead we see stronger increases in beta relative to the other ones. And you can see the complexity measured here in bodily versus the visual effect is not so much localized in the back of the scalp. So the back of the scalp, suggesting visual processing happening in visual imagery, but not in bodily effects. And finally, emotional and metacognitive effects, tapping more strongly into these complexity measures. This idea that the brain is visiting different states, or different possibilities at least, or a larger repertoire of different states. Some ideas that we've been playing around with Raphael, but we still have to implement, is how we can incorporate natural language processing into the data that we've collected experimentally, and how we can use this to bridge with neuronal data. So we can have our reports in which, using this microphenomenological interview, that we have time tagged to specific aspects of the experience. The interesting thing is that we can then try to characterize how the semantic distance or different natural language processing methods can relate to different EEG measures over time. And we can have this sort of like multidimensional space, brain state relating to the semantic, how the semantic distance changes over time. And this idea of semantic distance, again, is kind of like resonant with this idea that in the psychedelic state, there's an expansion of the semantic node. So we have a bit of evidence on this that comes from intuitions from research in the 1960s and a study in the 90s in which they see an increase in indirect semantic priming for psilocybin versus MDMA and placebo. So possibly indicating that there's an increase in the semantic node in these states. So, for example, Michael Schartner, who has been using this brain measure, Lempel-Siff complexity. So Lempel-Siff complexity tries to characterize the state by trying to compress the information that a given brain state can give us. The more you can compress this information, the lower the Lempel-Siff complexity value can be. So his idea, but the thing is that we don't have any sort of information of what this means in terms of brain activity or what this means in terms of phenomenal activity. The intuition of Michael Schartner is that this measure of Lempel-Siff complexity might relate to the amount of information that in terms of phenomenology is happening at a given amount in time. So we can test this empirically. We can use natural language processing and try to look at semantic distance with the intuition that the larger the semantic distance that can happen in a specific context corresponds to larger amount of information being experienced by a participant at a given moment in time. And we can have different values of this complexity measure over time. And we can test this hypothesis. And finally, or not almost finally, we can think about how the system is perturbed, not only in this kind of like direct experience, so you have the DMP experiences last for 10 minutes sort of scale, but we can think about long-term effects, how the system can change over time in a larger amount of scale. One particular aspect that I'm interested in is like folk beliefs on metaphysical aspects or naive beliefs about the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality and how they can change after a very strong psychedelic experience. So we're currently probing into this using questionnaires, but asking people to respond on their beliefs before the experience and also at different points in time at a macro scale. So we can think maybe that idealism might increase at the beginning after an experience, and we can possibly speculate that this also relates to increases in deterministic views on what people can do about their destiny. This is also interesting because it can also tell us a bit how these sort of like meta priors can relate to certain therapeutic outcomes, or how people view themselves. And we can also try to think about how the acute experience might mediate these changes in these meta priors. And if there is an actual interesting cascade between sensory effects and these strong meta priors about, what is the nature of consciousness, what is the nature of reality, and so on. But we can also look at the very micro scale, and we can look at that specific moment in time in which the system is disconnected, and we can try to probe into this by trying to characterize the state in sophisticated, complex ways. And we can also try to probe into this experimentally by using, for example, passive paradigms. So a typical example that is used sometimes in dream research is subjects are pressing a little squeeze ball or something like this, and you can measure the amount of pressure as people are drifting off into sleep. So possibly like a proxy of this disconnection emerging. And we can test empirically if similar transitions are happening at this micro scale in these different possibilities of disconnection in different states. So that could be entering the DMT space, or entering the dream state or microdreaming, or maybe even strong states of absorption in meditative states. So in conclusion, the idea is trying to propose how, through different experimental methods, we can use a process-based approach, a temporal, in which the temporal dynamics are taken into account, and how this can enable us to test overlaps between different experiences, how can it enable us to characterize multidimensional aspects of consciousness, and hopefully also bring us a bit closer into this idea of understanding consciousness of what is it like to be sort of approach. We can also test these discontinuities. We can try to see if these discontinuities are sort of a fundamental property for these radical states of consciousness. We can look at phenomena such as image formation, this idea of disconnection or sensing presences. And we can also try to look into the mechanisms using psychophysical experiments. We can also think about trajectories and how these dynamics can change both at the micro and the micro scale. And yeah, that's it.
So we only have 5 minutes for few questions. So this time we're going first David and then okay.
Please,
David.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I will ask you about like the processual and the aspect of the DMT experience. Because what I observed in fieldwork about ayahuasca, which is like one was composed more by DMT, is that there is kind of gradual processual development of like some phenomenological traits of the experience. For instance, the sense of agency that you were talking about. Frequently, like it's not like an automatic thing. Like people like seems to perceive beings more and more with the time and with the experience. So basically, as a social scientist, I hypothesize that it's the consequence of like a social learning based on the interactional devices like ritual, inviting people to perceive presences, and then like yeah. So I wanted to know like from your perspective, like from neuroscientific perspective, how can you explain the fact that there's that kind of learning, but it seems that there's that kind of processual, gradual development of some phenomenological traits of the DMT experience?
Well, I would say that this, like the idea of interactional kind of like devices makes a lot of sense in that. So the idea that the system is, the system kind of like tends to these homeostatic mechanisms in which, whatever its experience is accounted by its immediate priors. But if you put it into a particular context, like a ritual setting, in which this priors are kind of like gradually induced, and not only are they gradually sort of induced, but they're assimilated progressively by the system. You can think of this learning process as like this idea of coupling with the environment in a progressive fashion, so that the system is fairly robust learning, especially when it comes to this big priors on like agency, entities, and so on. They may take a bit of time and some continuous sort of feedback, and we can think of this feedback as these interactional devices. I think so. I don't know if it makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, short question from
Yes, it's actually addressing both of you because it's more philosophical. First, that when you do this microphenomenological analysis, you should be very careful of not confusing the time of the representation with the representation of time. This is common method then, that we assume that time is represented by time itself in the brain, and this could not be the case. Second, you have to be very careful as well of speaking at the precise moment in which something becomes conscious, because that moment does not exist. So there is not the moment in which something enters consciousness. He claims that he has multiple graph theory, but I think it's more like a consequence of the uncertainty principle of Fourier analysis, that for something to be conscious, you need a coalition of oscillations, and you can only have, in the frequency domain, you have well-characterized that the frequency, you have less characterized the time, and vice versa. So I think that this is some when you speak about, you go into the small time scales, you have to be mindful of these two things. I'm not confusing the representation of time with the representation, and be careful of these words, the time at which something becomes consciousness, because that time does not exist.
Chris, maybe you want to say something the temporal anchoring, because I think that's why we're not confusing representation of time and time of.
Yeah, but do you mean in the microphenomenological stuff?
Yeah, because when you cue, especially when you use cues.
Yeah. No, we're not. We're actually, what we're doing is we're not looking at how people perceive time in this specific experimental context, but we're simply using the cue. So people are asked for intensity ratings at every minute.
They don't have to estimate any time themselves.
No, they don't have to estimate.
No.
We are inferring that from.
I gave a 5. I gave a rating of 5, and then this happened. So they remember succession, which I think is fairly plausible that they can remember the broad succession of events, right? So
it was like a Livet experiment, sort of.
Yeah, exactly.
But then it argued that was flawed as well. But let's not go down there.
Well, then it would hate the whole microphenomenological approach.
Yeah.
And then again,
I didn't know, but I love the approach. But it's not that.
So what? Yeah. So we really have time for a tiny question, and I think it was.
Yes, thank you. Yes. What I find really, thank you in the first place. This is really extremely exciting and fascinating. What I find most striking actually is when you look in the literature of EEG and the disorders of consciousness, a very predominant and highly predictive pattern of residual consciousness is the move from the frequency band energy from the alpha band to the theta and delta band. That's exactly what you show in your time-dissolved analysis.
Yeah.
Without anticipating your speculation, I would be really interested in understanding how you go about that, or if there's any link that you could hypothesize.
Well, really, it's hard to tell. I mean, you also see that in the transition into sleep as well, right? So again, I think this the notion of specificity. Maybe there's a common mechanism involved in the disconnection. Maybe we're seeing just that disconnection mechanism happening in this gradual tuning down even of those low frequency over time in disorders of consciousness. But also in the data that we see is increases in complexity. And, using same measures in different populations is fairly, it has been seen already a couple of times that there's strong decreases in complexity at the same time. So I would really say it's a multidimensional state of these different measures that can characterize these different states of consciousness.
A very adventurous speculation could be that people who are currently absent of consciousness are locked into a near-death experience.
Well, yeah.
Well, that would be good for them because they are great. They feel very good.
Most
of the time, you can have hell.
Don't get me wrong, I don't want to promote that speculation, but I find it a very interesting point of contact.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think we can try to do some microphenomenological analysis on people that have exited comas and how they went into it. That could be an interesting sort of way to probe into that, maybe.
All right, let's thank Chris one more time. And without further ado, because we unfortunately don't have time for it right now, we'll have one just before the final discussion.
Probably, I thought it would be short.
Right. So let's introduce Enzo, who is a somewhat new member of ALIUS, and he's going to talk to us about from molecules to consciousness towards an integrative neuroscience of serotonergic psychology.
Yeah, so well, the title looks like more like the title of a movie, or a book by Michael Pollan, From Molecules to Consciousness. But I'm going to deliver, actually. I'm going to show a link between molecules and consciousness. I used to work in the neuroimaging of REMs of deep sleep, and this I found that interesting for consciousness. But at some point it got boring because it's either on and off. So then I basically got in contact with Robin Caja-Harris, and I got into this whole psychedelic business, so to say, and I found it fascinating for many different reasons, scientifically, but also sociologically. People go nuts. I'm not speaking about David Nutt, by the way. People go, do I have a pointer somewhere? Yeah, which is this guy here, and this is Robin, and this is Amanda, who is a very rich and intelligent lady who drilled a hole through her skull in the 60s to basically expand her consciousness. This is Robin, and this is Mendel Kaling, a colleague of London as well. So these are very smart people who conducted the study. So basically, I was really amazed as people go crazy about psychedelics these days. You know, when the study got published, you got things like this. This doesn't look like a brain on LSD. It looks more like an X-ray. This is imaging shows brains lit up after taking LSD, whatever it means lit up. This is one of my favorites. This is I saw this live. This is when the interview started. This is Robin, and this guy asked Robin whether he ever tried LSD himself, and Robin said no, and both started laughing for quite like 5 minutes. Okay, so this is David Nutt, completely exhausted from, you know, speaking about the experiment somewhere, I don't know, probably in Turkey. You know, it just went completely out of control. It went so much out of control that at some point some neuroscientists say that Donald Trump needed LSD because, you know, the biggest president is his ego, so it should be a good experience. I think these neuroscientists should be nuts. But then I found out that that person was myself. Apparently, I am quoted, I did not say directly that Donald Trump should take LSD, but they inferred from that way, so this is weird. Then, of course, all reality is an illusion, trippy finding on LSD. Apparently, I said this at some point, I don't remember anymore. There is objective reality and then this our reality. Sorry that I will use Simpsons memes a lot because they're a big thing in Argentina and also in the US, maybe not here in France so much, but they will be coming. So there is reality and reality. And then I started receiving lots of emails from people asking me, you know, where can buy LSD or can I cure cancer with LSD? And of all the emails I received, this was my favorite. It was called Question About LSD. It said, hello, Mr. Tagliasucci. Nobody calls me like that, by the way. Me and my friends have recently used LSD, and we noticed that we could understand each other without words in our trip. We talked and thought about it and decided that our brains were fast as computers and we could predict ideas which appear in mind of companion. Why we understood each other without words? Did we communicate non-verbal or mind really was an illusion? Excuse me, Matt English. With best regards, Dimitri. So when somebody asks me, you know, why do you study psychedelics? They sometimes, you know, yeah, because I like drugs. And I say, no, neuroscience cannot ignore this. You have a bunch of guys in Russia thinking they can read each other's minds because they took a molecule, and a very small amount of the molecule, by the way. So this has to be explained by neuroscience. So the talk might as well be called What Happened in Dimitri's Brain. So what do we know? We know that Dimitri took LSD, luckily, because we don't know what was on the tab. Then the molecule acted at the molecular level or the receptor binding level. Then, of course, as we have shown, and also in the Imperial team has shown, changes in brain networks that you can measure with fMRI on EEG, like Chris has shown, will support changes, you know, on cognition and so on. Finally, you have at the phenomenology, you know, what it felt like, what he felt like, and he wrote to me in this email. And there are huge gaps between this level and here, there is a huge gap, and of course, this and between this is basically what some people will even call the hard problem of consciousness. So what can we do about these gaps between levels? Well, I suggest that whatever happens between the levels, we don't know. So let's put some dots in place and try to connect the dots, like in those things that we were kids, you know. And I suggest a strategy to do so. First, we do an embedding of phenomenology, whatever that means, you know, in a space which is a metric space. There is a notion of a distance. Like here, you know, there is a notion of a distance, the Euclidean distance. We try to embed phenomenology either by free speech narratives or by questionnaires in that space. Then we describe the physical state of the system at different resolutions that will also be metric spaces. And then we look for isometries between the spaces, meaning that whether one thing is close in one space, is close in the other, and vice versa, or similarity between similarities, or the distinction between first versus second order isomorphisms. What do I mean by this? Well, suppose you have, this is quite small, but you can see it. Well, phenomenology, and this is Daniel Dennett was here, this will be just to back him out. You know, I'm just conceptualizing consciousness as some little person seeing inside your brain. This is basically the Cartesian theater. But this is just an illustration of phenomenology. So phenomenology, you can probe by different ways, you know, questionnaires, narratives, you know, experiential narratives, and so on. But by any means that you do, you try to find a way to map that into a space, in which, in this case, each point will be a subject. Subject A, B, C, and D. Then, in the latter part of my talk, they will be molecules, but now there will be subjects. And then you can do the same, for example, with activity patterns in the default mode network, and you can map them into a certain space, and then you can do the same for activity patterns in a different network of the brain. The problem is how can you connect points between these two different spaces, because these are very different spaces. You embedded them in spaces that are completely different. So they are pears and apples sort of question. So how can we do that? Well, you can sort of solve this by looking at second order mappings, meaning that you do not map the points, but you map the arrows that connects the points. So inside this space, we have a notion of how close is to be, this point is as close to this one in this amount and so on, and at this level they are close in this we have this certain of distance which I'm representing by the arrows, how close they are in each different space, and then you map the distance, you map the arrows, you do a mapping of the arrows themselves. This is something I got from my early days as a mathematician, category theory and all that. And in this case, for example, it turns out that when you plot the mapping of the arrows between this space and the default mode space, you have a nice correlation, meaning that these two levels could be related. But when you do this with the salience network, in this hypothetical example, you do not see a clear mapping between the points. So this shows that you can use this second order mapping to infer whether relationships at different levels exist. So this is, then of course you can do, if you are using, for example, free speech or unconstrained narratives, you could, for example, for each subject do a topic detection. Raphael showed a little bit of that, well, he showed workloads, but you can think that those workloads could be decomposed into sub-workload or concept workload or concept loads that refer to different facets of the experience. And then, each subject will be talking about different things that happen. And then by a trick, which I will show later, you can even relate the topics to basically to the different networks. So you can, in the end, sort of go back to a sort of a first order mapping by first jumping through the second order mapping. So I would like to show this, all the work. I'm an fMRI person, so to say, so I did lots of work in human neuroimaging of neuron. But I'm going to skip this, and this is very difficult for me to let this go, but I want the talk to be short, so I will make that effort. So this is missing. So we jump to the important part of my talk, which is molecular level and binding affinity. So I don't know if you are very aware of how psychedelics act on the brain, but I will basically explain the situation to you. So they are supposed to, all of them act, and there's animal studies have shown us pretty much lots of evidence that there is a receptor in the brain, that is CHU receptor, that a necessary condition for a psychedelic experience to emerge seems to be at least partial agonism at the CHU receptor. That doesn't mean that if you have agonism of that receptor, you will have a psychedelic experience, but you might need this necessary condition. But if you have only that condition, why is that you have a variety of different psychedelic experience? Because as Raphael showed, the workloads for psilocybin and the workload for LSD, I keep saying workloads, sorry, they are concept clouds, they were different, so the experiences are probably different, the DMT experience are different, so how could this be that it's a single receptor through this thing act, you get different experience? This seems to be a problem. So one hypothesis, this is what, for example, David Nichols would say, is that these things are called, the CHU receptor is what is called a Schick-Pertl-Koppel receptor. Don't mind the fancy term. It simply means that show a phenomenon called functional selectivity, in which what happens when the molecule binds to the receptor depends on the shape of the molecule that is binding. The analogy will be, we think of receptors as locks and molecules as keys. And we think, you just put the key, and if it's more or less well, it's a full or partial agonism. But then you open the door, and then you cross, and you are here. Functional selectivity means that depending on the shape of the key, when you open the door, you end up in a different space. Buenos Aires, Paris, New York, That's the concept. There is another hypothesis that, of course, CHU agonism is a necessary condition, but there are other receptors in the brain that could also be important to determine the quality of the subjective experience. So note that these hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. You could have them both at the same time. This is important to note, especially not to make David Nichols angry. So we approach this the following way. We have all this data from Arrowhead, subjective experience, written reports. we have, I put right here, but we have other sources of data that are basically at many sites of the brain in which, of the cell in which a molecule can bind, like 40 different sites. We have what is called the binding affinity, that you can think of how well the key is fitting in the lock. Of course, LSD fits very well in the serotonin 2A lock. Serotonin fits perfectly because the lock was made for the key, but we find these affinities of the receptors, and then we also have how similar the molecules are in terms of molecular structure. So how do we compare subjective experience? Well, we use a different approach than Raphael, who used a word Chubek. We use latent semantic analysis, and I'm not going to go into the details, but basically you construct a matrix in which the documents here, the columns, will be a drug in the arrow with corpus, and the terms are the words that people use. So if you get the cosine distance of these things, you will have problems, because these things will be full of zeros, because the terms are not used by everybody. So basically, you apply a technique that is called singular value decomposition to reduce the dimension of this and group the words into concepts. So I have an example here from headlines from the New York Times. You have 2 headlines for politics, 3 for science, and 2 for food or recipes. And if you compute the pairwise cosine similarity between the headlines, without applying the method, you see, you have a high similarity along the diagonal, because of course every document, every headline is similar to itself, but you don't have much off diagonal. But after applying the method, LSA, you see that, for example, now you have similarity between the 2 headlines of politics. Well, in science, it did not work so well. You have 2 that are grouped and 1 that is left alone, and the food are 2, the same of the 2 groups. So we did this for the whole arrow with corpus, and we came out with this graph. This graph basically is another way of showing what Raphael already showed to you. Each point is a drug, and the color represents pharmacological classification of a drug, and they are connected based on the similarity, the semantic similarity of the reports, how similar the phenomenology based on the report is, which I'm not saying that it's perfect, and some of you will have many methodological issues with this, and I will be glad to discuss them, but at this point, this simply represents semantic similarity. So, for example, you have a cluster that is made, so purple means serotonergic psychedelics, but these are mostly naturally occurring serotonergic psychedelics, but then you have a cluster which is mostly made of serotonergic psychedelics that are synthetic, and when we look at afterwards what is distinguishing between these 2 clusters, basically something that is called the body load, how hard these things hit you in the body, not only in consciousness. You have a cluster, it's a large cluster that is based on sedatives, which are green, but you have also this small subcluster here, which is based on some sedatives, but mostly antipsychotic drugs. You have this more weird cluster in which you have some deliriant agents, but some stimulants. You have another one which is basically made of herbs, yerba mate we drink in Argentina. I suppose this is a stimulant, but you have other things that are sedatives, but come from plants. This is my favorite cluster. It has 4 elements: alcohol, beer, wine, alcohol, hard alcohol, and methamphetamine. So this tells you, alcohol, just be careful with that. And this is like the empathogenic entactogen cluster, things that you take to go to the club, for example. This is the hero's quest. The hero with 1,000 faces, the narrative arcs. Well, what we did is that we looked at the temporal time course of the expression of positive and negative emotion in 2 reports as a duration, not in time, because time is not a variable here. The variable is the number of words. But when we collapse, we rescale them to be in the same scale. We have an idea of, for example, someone takes a deliriant agent. He's happy at the beginning, starts to deteriorate. Then he becomes a little bit better. That goes downhill. The present sedative is all the way downhill. A stimulant, you start, and then, oh shit. Well, an entactogen like MDMA is similar. Oh, I love everybody. Shit, why did I do this? The only 2 categories of drugs that end up higher than they begin with are psychedelic other, which includes salvia divinorum, cannabis, and a couple that Amanita muscaria, and serotonergic psychedelics. You know, these you have these up and downs, and this is more like a peak, but both of them end up higher when you begin. This is just a curiosity. It doesn't have to do anything with the main research. We will publish this eventually, but yeah. So the main point of my talk is this thing. Too big for a Nobel Prize, remembering Sasha Shulgin. Well, is it too big for a Nobel Prize? And this was written by David Pesty, who said that Sasha Shulgin, who basically synthesized lots of molecules, psychedelic molecules, and mescaline analogs mostly. In the meantime, you can read this sentence, which basically he expressed his idea that one should be able to decompose the effect of a drug as a sum of different parts, you know, like a linear combination of effects. Well, he proposed at some time that basically Sasha Shulgin should have won a Nobel Prize with Albert Hofmann, and I would throw Richard Schultes as well in the same. But I don't think it's like that. But I think that Sasha Shulgin actually could have a chance of winning a Nobel Prize, because many of the molecules he came up with are halogenated molecules that are very good for PET, and they have, you know, this high binding specificity for certain receptors, and they're very useful tools to map the distribution of receptors in the brain, and the group of David Nichols did lots of work based on this. So maybe the Nobel Prize should have been for David Nichols and Sasha Shulgin, who, as a matter of fact, were the two guys who came up with a better synthesis of MDMA, much well. So the reason why we now can buy MDMA and it's cheaper is because of these two guys. So it would have been a fun Nobel Prize, you know, because of PET and radioligands, and also because of the discovery of how to synthesize MDMA based on essential oils from plants. So these people, ladies and gentlemen, are molecules. Well, these are not the molecules. The molecules are much smaller. You wouldn't see them in the screen, but they are a representation of molecules. They are not the best representations of molecules you can imagine. They are just very what you see in organic chemistry books. There are two classes of molecules that we are investigating in the study, and they look very different in principle. These are phenylethylamines and these are tryptamines. They are not so different if you think that you can wrap this tail around and basically put somehow this into a cyclic structure. Why these things are called phenylethylamines is because this is called a phenyl group, this is called an ethyl group, and this is an amine. So this is phenylethylamine. Why these things are called tryptamines beats me. I don't know. So basically what we did at this point, you can imagine gathering from all the essays. What I'm going to show you, you can imagine the next slide. We have the similarity of these things in terms of binding affinity, that is how close they are, the correlation of the binding affinity vectors at many sites, and we have how similar they are in terms of the molecular structure, but we also have how much they are in terms of the space of the phenomenology, the first one, in the first level I showed to you. And when we do this analysis, we plot in one axis the similarity in terms of binding affinity, and we plot in the other axis the semantic similarity. We got a correlation of 0.6 with a p-value of minus 10 to the minus 16. So of course, everybody has seen correlation with effect size is larger than this, but this is not this is a moderate effect size. You have to take this seriously, I think. If you do the same correlation between the structural similarity and the semantic similarity, it's much worse, and even more interesting, the similarity between the binding affinity and the structural similarity of the compounds is even worse than the correlation between the binding affinity and the semantic similarity. So this seems to be that there was a link after all, from molecules to consciousness. But does this tell us anything? Isn't this obvious? Well, could be, but this is where I say that you can actually explore parts of this space where you were building the second order isomorphism to get more information, because what we did is that we basically took all the permutations possible between the receptors that we included in the binding affinity computations, and we selected the subgroup of receptors that led to a better prediction of the phenomenology, meaning that maybe if you just get the serotonin receptor, you get an R of 0.7. Maybe this implies that all the other receptors are shrunk. You just need serotonin receptors. That's not the case. You get a much lower correlation if you only consider serotonin receptors. But if you go through all the permutations, you find this optimal combination of receptors, which include muscarinic receptors, dopamine receptors, and serotonin receptors, and this is what leads you to the highest correlation. And this systematic exploration is basically something that what I think is useful. Then we did the topic analysis. This is basically principal component analysis of narratives, and these are not concept clouds. These are no, these are concept clouds, I think. Yeah, because we did this after LSA, so these are concept clouds. And what you see is what people are talking about when they talk about their experience, and we have these 5 clusters. The first one is consciousness. Things as visual, pattern, reality. The second one is more like body load. You start to get things like peak, dosage, stimulate, show is here in the middle. You have like things that relate to how it hits you in the body. Well, the third component is a nice example of how arrow width can be tricky, because it does not really relate to a conscious experience. It relates to the preparation of plant materials. Words such as boil, bowl, ounce, add, smell. These are people who are preparing datura, for example, or any plant. This is obviously the dependence component. You have clean, nausea, money, vomit, dealer, and stuff. This is the therapeutic component. Words related to getting better and certain disorders. So you can put in this radar plot different drugs. For example, LSD has this spike in the consciousness component. TM2 has this consciousness component part, and also this body load part. And there is one person in the audience, that this David Luke Williams, who we discussed, that basically there are anecdotal reports that TMA2 has a higher body load than LSD, even though it's psychedelic, but there are so little reports that this is all anecdotal evidence. And it is, but well, it makes sense at least in terms of the results. And for ibogaine, for example, as you know, ibogaine can be used to treat certain disorders. You have this peak in the therapeutic and the dependence component. This one I will only show 2. Datura has its peak in the consciousness component, but also in the preparation component, because you need to boil the leaves and so on. And cocaine has a spike in the dependent component. But then you can also correlate across the drugs, and link specific receptors to these topics. So you can link the CHU-A and CHU-C receptors, which are basically the 2 receptors that are mostly linked to enabling the psychedelic experience. They have this spike in the perceptual component. This is the mu opioid receptor, has this spike in the dependence and the therapeutic component. And these are just examples. And the calcium channel for beats me why has a peak in the dependence component. We replicated the whole paper using independent results from data coming from Zurich, from Basel, from a group of Matthias Lichty. We replicated, the correlations are the same. And this we just published, and I want to say a few words about this. This, I think, is the most important paper I published in my life. But even if you look at the functional selectivity, this idea that what happens when you put the key in the lock depends on the shape of the key, that translates to the fact that different molecules, when they bind to the receptor, this is the CHU receptor, they recruit messengers within the cell to do different stuff. So you could compute the correlation between the profile of the second messengers and do the same thing. In this case, you compare the semantic similarity of the reports. I am going like too deep into reductionism here. I'm saying that you can correlate conscious reports of people in arrow with second messengers expressions within a cell, but apparently you can. I mean, the correlation is there. This is the semantic similarity, and this is the similarity of the recruitment of the second messenger. And the paper for González Maeso neuron has error bars, so we could do this bootstrap analysis just by sampling with the same distribution. And this is the level of significance, and for most bootstrap iterations, we have a positive correlation. So what are the conclusions? I'm going to end. This is less than half an hour. The reported subjective effects are related to agonism at an ample range of receptors. This is what I first showed, that all other receptors matter for the conscious experience. But as well, the reported effects are related to functional selectivity as Xi protein copy receptors, one in particular I showed for the CHU-A receptor. But all the other receptors that were also important, many of them also are Xi coupling protein receptors, so probably functional selectivity at those receptors also matter. So a conclusion, these are the conclusions of the paper, and the secondary conclusion is what a mess. because the brain is complicated. This is just to show that Alexander Shulgin was being too naive when he, this linear decomposition effect of a drug. So I want to show you a couple of plans for the future. We want to do the first ever neuroimaging study in Buenos Aires of mescaline. There are many reasons to do it. One of the reasons is that it seems to be a drug that Native Americans in the US have a high predisposition towards becoming alcoholic, and peyote ceremonies basically are very good. They have this saying of whiskey and peyote don't mix, that basically these peyote ceremonies, there is old evidence showing that they can cut the effects of early onset alcoholism at a very early stage. But there could be other alkaloids in peyote as well that could be doing this, not only mescaline. So this is again a Simpson reference. Nobody ever paid attention to the other alkaloids in peyote, only mescaline, because mescaline, Aldous Huxley and well on. So what we are doing is more like a chemical informatics analysis. This drug here is if you suspect that you're going to throw up because of a reason, you take an antiemetic. This thing here is an antiemetic. It's an antagonist of the serotonin 3 receptor. But there, it seems to be evidence that it is also useful not only as an antiemetic, but to cut down the effects of early onset alcoholism. So what we are doing is that nobody knows anything about the binding affinity of these other peyote alkaloids. So what we are doing is we are doing in silico receptorome screening. I can explain you. This involves huge databases of compounds that have been assayed. And we have these candidate molecules within peyote. This doesn't look so different from this. I mean, if you look it with more or less like, peyonine has the highest, inside peyote, it has the highest affinity for the 3 receptor, and we suspect it's an antagonist. And we are now building docking simulators in which we have the protein itself, and we dock the molecule to the protein, and in the end I want to synthesize peyonine without going to shale, because one of the intermediate steps in the synthesis is mescaline, which, as you all know, is a Schedule 1 drug, it's illegal, and then to do animal studies and so on. And we have lots of limitations, and if there are not many pharmacologists in the audience, all these limitations might not be important, but we couldn't possibly solve all these limitations. This is what I told the reviewer. So can you? Well, apparently he couldn't. So this is the team that helped me basically do the whole thing. The Imperial College team has been huge, very important for me to get into the topic. And well, Suresh is mentioned here because I did not show the imaging results, but those involved Suresh, Robin, and Leo, and David. These people, ladies and gentlemen, are hippies. Fire and Arrow, we don't know their names. They live in a place that is called Grass Valley in California. Take note of the name. And they are nice people in a certain way. And they author the papers. And nobody ever questioned that we are submitting papers with authors that are called Fire and Earth. I mean, I think that if Chair, for example, wants to submit scientific paper, you cannot put your name Chair or Madonna, but Fire and Earth get away with it. And this is my team. These are the people. Fede is mostly interested in the alcoholism issue, as you can see. Cami is the one who did all the semantic analysis. And Carla does pretty much everything. We cannot do much without Carla. And I wanted to, I did this very quickly, and I think I have 5 more minutes, I guess, because I only spoke for half an hour. I found this fascinating. Like yesterday, anthropologists, the presentations, they read stuff because that makes sense. I mean, if you really came up with something that you think you wrote it very well, which is not going to be the case by the way of what I wrote, well, you might as well just read it instead of just improvising as I did. And I really believe this is the most important paper I produce in my life. I'm going to read the text I wrote that I will publish. Once the publish is online, I will put online. I have to explain why. And you think, well, this is a little bit egotistic, to explain why my personal motivations. Well, it will turn out to be that actually it's not so much about my personal motivations, what is important to me, but it's very related to why I think it's important to science. So I shall always take between 5 and 10 minutes to read why I think this is the most important paper in my career. So I see that of all the more than 50 manuscripts that I had the fortune of, or misfortune of authoring or co-authoring, the present one I consider the most special at the personal level, And I hope it also turns to be relevant at the scientific level. Sorry to say this, I neglected to say one thing. This has been published in Frontiers of Neuroscience. I'm saying this is the most important paper in my life. Some people will say, well, Frontiers is a shitty journal. Well, could be, but there is something that you should never do as a scientist, that is mix up the medium with the message. Keep that in mind. You should never do that. The medium is one thing and the message is the other thing, and these things are separate. So, could be a shitty journal, but my paper might as not be shitty. So, and it might as well be the case that the reasons why it matters to me at the personal level are also those that make it scientifically relevant. So, early signs that this manuscript was somehow different to me appear in the form of alternating feelings of being proud about the research, then doubtful, then even skeptical, and then even ashamed, with this cycle repeating many, many times. So why all these ups and downs, this soaring and diving, and I'm quoting the famous poem by Virginia Woolf, why was all this passion for? After some reflection, I came up with a series of reasons, which I've summarized in the following. The first reason: there are many levels of description in consciousness research, and psychedelic research is a subfield of consciousness research. From the molecular microscopic reductionist end towards the other end of the description, phenomenology, or what it feels like, these are the two ends, so to say, but in between you have many other things. In our paper, we linked both ends directly, without nothing in between. We linked action at the molecular level with phenomenology, so this was for some quite time confusing and troubling to me. Shouldn't you need to go through all the intermediate levels of description, the cell, the networks of cells, the cortical columns, the networks of columns, etc., to do what we wanted to do? Well, it turns out that apparently you don't. I had this feeling of almost being ashamed of bypassing all these intermediate levels of description, because people doing great job at these levels of description, and also because it's there where you find the relevant causal links. But on the other hand, if you settle for correlation instead of causation, which is pretty much a standard settlement neuroscientists make these days, it so happens that you can perform this jump from one level to another directly. So it is as if jumping over a canyon without even practicing jumping over a small puddle of water. Before that. But one thing is for sure, you know whether you made it to the other side of the canyon or not. Second reason, I've said many times, shockingly, that using a scale such as the altered state of consciousness scale to quantify psychedelic experience is sort of a remnant of behaviorism. Instead of having a rat pull a lever, you have a human being ticking boxes on a piece of paper. This is to exaggerate my opinion that human consciousness should be probed by means of free and constrained experiential narratives. This method of analysis presents a host of methodological problems by itself. However, I want to highlight that these reports are deliberate acts of speech. So in one case, you have this black box, you give LSD to this black box, and then the black box outputs a series of numbers. Following the proposed alternative approach, you do the same thing to the black box, but then the black box produces a speech, and through the speech act tells you what it feels like to be a black box. And even more, what it feels like to be a black box high under LSD. So the fact that our methods work well represents a validation of free and constrained experiential narratives as windows into consciousness. And for me, which is in my opinion an important step forward in the field. There is a third reason. Shulgin, the guy I told you about, an organic chemist by profession, and a very good one at that, by the way, used to say that he was a tool maker. He made tools for consciousness research, and he made a whole bunch of them. Most of them are published in two books called PICAL and TICAL, and if you don't know what the acronyms mean, you are encouraged to find out. But what do I mean by he published his tools? Well, he was all about what these days people call open science and open methods. Nowadays, it is increasingly common for researchers to upload their Python notebooks to allow the replication of their analysis. Well, what Shulgin published precise instructions for the chemical synthesis of his tools for consciousness research in the second halves of PICAL and TICAL. And he got into some big trouble with the DEA because of that, by the way, because as you might guess, such tools are psychedelic molecules that can be used in different contexts, and as anything in life, they can be misused and abused to the point of death. Yet, he insisted that even though people misuse these tools for recreational purposes, His goal when creating this molecule was to provide methods for scientists to alter consciousness in subtle ways so that scientists could understand consciousness better. And our paper is the first time that I'm aware of somebody using Sasha Shulgin's tool the way he meant them to be used, at least employing quantitative methodology. So since Sasha passed away in 2014, we will never know what he would have thought of our paper, but I'm inclined to think that he might have liked it, and I feel very happy about this prospect. And there is a fourth and final reason. This is for me the most profound. The last reason is somewhat pessimistic. It can be summarized in the following statement. This is as good as it gets. But this I don't mean that our paper is as good as it gets. I mean, other teams in the world could have done a much better job with the available sources of data. But it is precisely in the sources of data where one has to admit, at least to the present day, that this is as good as it gets. And I mean this in a quite deep and, in my opinion, highly non-trivial way. Because once you convince yourself that the black box telling you all about being a black box is a useful way to study consciousness, and especially altered state of consciousness, you realize the following fact. There is no way an ethics committee will grant us or any other lab permission to study 20 or so psychedelic drugs we investigated in a paper under a controlled laboratory setting with a double-blind placebo-controlled protocol, and so on. And they wouldn't because they shouldn't. I mean, it would be in fact unethical. It would be unethical to administer 200 doses of DOA, DOV, 2CB fly to people in the lab, to experimental subjects. You just can't do that, and please don't, even if an ethics committee tells you it's all right to do it. So does this mean that our work was unethical? Well, upon first thought, the answer is an emphatic no, unless you believe in backwards causation, because Erowid users had already done it upon themselves many times, and for many different drugs, and their self-reported narratives are available for everybody to read and see, and Raphael have used them, for example, at the Erowid experience boards. It could be argued, though, that the sharing of the narratives may encourage others to try the drugs the users are writing about. This has been a contentious issue from the earliest stages of Erowid. However, I believe this concern is dissipated by the fact that Erowid is a truly pioneering website in providing information on harm reduction, safe dosage, set and setting consideration, and so on. So by this I mean that Erowid is actively involved in taking care of its contributors. I do believe, however, and this is the final reason the paper is so important to me, that the Erowid experience boards must be conceived or considered as a prime example of what nowadays has become quite fashionable and is known as citizen science. A paradigmatic example of citizen science is the iNaturalist website. In these websites, people like you and me go with their smartphones and take pictures of different species of birds, mammals, plants, and then they upload the pictures, the photos, together with the geolocalization. Seen from this perspective, it's absolutely clear to me that in the same way citizens explore the natural world using iNaturalist website, citizens also explore the inner world of consciousness using the Erowid website. Some of the drugs they consume in this exploration are considered very safe, such as LSD. Others can be highly dangerous. But we have to admit that it was highly valuable for us, in terms of our paper, that an ample range of compounds was explored by Erowid users, and many of these compounds induce experience that most of us would consider unpleasant, to say the least. But in the same way, iNaturalist users would perhaps love to get research-grade close photographs of a grizzly bear. And because one can imagine that those photographs are scarce, not many people are getting close to a grizzly bear and getting a photo of the grizzly bear in the face. Yet iNaturalists is not liable in case you get too close to the bear and the bear kills you. It does, however, benefit if you survive the encounter and you upload the photograph of the grizzly bear. But as opposed to Erowid, I haven't seen any guidelines in iNaturalist for how to survive a close encounter with a grizzly bear. So when the ethical problems of Erowid are discussed, one must always raise the same question all over again. Are these ethical problems considered to arise because they relate to drug-related experiences only? Why do we draw a strict line between the ethical problems of drug-induced experience and other kinds of experience? Why do we fixate as a society on distinguishing so clearly between drug-induced experiences from other kinds of experiences? For example, experiences like bungee jumping, one-night stands, riding a motorcycle at the highway, all of which carry certain risks, regardless as to whether they are drug-induced or not. So to conclude my reflection, the final sentence in our acknowledgement section of the paper reads, finally, we also thank the founders, curators, contributors, volunteers of the Erowid Center for sharing their data and for their decades of work on the experience report collection. And this is a real and heartfelt acknowledgement. Willing or not, some Erowid users went out and photographed the grizzly bear and shared experience with everybody. And this made our article possible in the first place. And while there will be future sources of data, for example, with people here, we envision an open platform that should supersede Erowid, at least in some ways, we still must acknowledge the following fact that Fire and Earth Erowid and their team of collaborators are truly pioneers in this kind of citizen science, and I hope that, that their groundbreaking work will be acknowledged by more and more researchers in the future. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, so we have 5-10 minutes for question, and then we have a panel discussion for 20 minutes, so for more discussion. I have a question, but first, any questions?
So I did it very short, so there could be questions, and nobody's asking any questions.
I have a question, so I'll start with my question. So when you showed your little concept clouds of different topics,
which one?
The ones with the consciousness, body load. Yeah,
this one.
This one. Yeah. So I have a concern. I don't know if it's a serious concern or not, but when we've in the study I've done on Erowid, when we've blinded the corpus, we've not just blinded for the names of the different drugs and so on. We've also blinded the corpus for the preparation, because the preparation gives away the drug that's used. We've blinded for addiction. We've blinded for all the context, ceremony, a party, club, and so on, because all of this can give away the drug, right? So
could give away the drug or the setting. So the problem is, where do you draw the line? I mean,
sure.
we blinded it for drug names, slang names, methods, routes of administration. But for example, a ceremony, you could partake of the ceremony is the settings, it's part of the conscious, the contents of the conscious experience the person is reporting. Could be a ceremony, or could be boiling some tea, or smelling something. So you have it is difficult to draw the line. You see, for me at least it was.
So yes and no, because like the ceremony is not part of it's the context, right? It's the setting, as you say. It's not part of the conscious experience. The conscious experience is like specific words that refer to phenomenal properties, right? So I would argue that body load, most of it refers to conscious experience, but boil, ounce, or withdrawal, all
but
of this.
Is this room part of your conscious experience? It is. And is
well, my experience is the room itself is not, but yeah.
Exactly, but it's part of your conscious content. The room is part of it, and it is also your setting. So the distinction between setting and contents of consciousness is not, I don't see it as straightforward as you see it, perhaps. Right. There's some words that, yes, they relate very strictly to setting, and some of them no, and the same for the preparation. Smell is something that is related to the preparation of substance, but you wouldn't want to censor the word smell. It's an action.
Smell, yes, because it directly refers to sensory experience.
Or objects.
Or ounce doesn't that directly
No,
refer
perhaps
to
it was not a good idea to not censor words such ounce, for example. We should have censored it retrospectively. Right. We acknowledge that. Some of these, and this is what I say, this component, we don't like it to be there. It is there. It means that we did not censor the corpus correctly. I do like these other two. I think they're important because they represent, we did this analysis with the whole, and we did not only focus on psychedelics, we also focus on stimulants and so on, and these are relevant things to describe, distinguish a drug such as cocaine from, a psychedelic, because that's what cocaine does in a way. It's, it's a dopamine serotonin, dopamine reuptake inhibitor. It makes you, somehow it turns to make you addicted. Right. So it's important to distinguish. It does not give away the identity of the drug in the same way that you leave the word cocaine or coke. So I think it's a great zone. You see where you draw a line. You have a point.
Yeah.
Some of these words shouldn't be there. I agree.
Yeah. So I think it's I agree with you. It's really tricky, and I guess you have different. My approach is very conservative. So I'd rather I'd rather go overboard and cut a
Yes.
few words that refer to consciousness than include.
I realized that when I saw your concept close, that you were being more conservative, and that's fine. And we were less conservative, and I wish I could have censored certain words retrospectively that we didn't. But on the other end, most of them I wouldn't have, like, nausea, anxiety, even words such as prescribe, because they relate to an experience of someone going to the doctor. I mean,
yeah, but that's not the drug-induced. If you want to correlate phenomenology with molecular
it is drug-induced. I mean, if you
going to the doctor is not part of.
Well, it's part of the vaccine experience, going to the doctor. This is not only about psychedelics. That's the point initially. Then we focus on psychedelics, but if we are talking about SSRIs, something, part of the experience is being depressed and describing your depression and how it got better with the drug. So it's a trip report means maybe different things for you and me.
Right.
For me, something more ample in a way.
Okay. Yeah. I guess.
But of course, if you are more conservative, you get what you got, which is perfect. I mean, especially it's maybe way better to study psychedelics, more suitable. You are thinking mostly on psychedelics when you did that. We are thinking on
basically
basically
drugs generally. But anyways, but we can.
Okay. I mean, my point is that where you put the line is tricky. It's a gray zone.
I agree. Yes, Matthieu.
Question of clarification, because perhaps you went back on this. When you said that there was another cohort on which you conduct the same analysis you did on Aeroid?
Yes.
Could you a bit more?
Not Aeroid. I only use Aeroid.
But when you talk about this...
The replication?
Yes.
No, that was a replication in terms of the binding affinity data. That was not Aeroid, but the pharmacological data. Pharmacological data coming from not the same drugs, some overlaps with the drugs, and not the same receptors, subset of the receptors, but not Aeroid was used in both situations. Yeah.
Do you have a knowledge of any other databases?
Well, you could scout like the blue light forums, for example, for experiences. You could go to a DMT Nexus if you're interested in DMT experiences. Well, and suppose the aim is that we will end up building our own platform.
The other platforms are very small, like Blue Light.
And there are forums, and the aesthetics are highly unique. The DMT Nexus aesthetics is even worse than Aeroid, These guys are really, you get the DMT experience just by looking at the website. So I think that, as you said, the set and setting of the website is important, so to say.
Follow up.
But do you have other data on the users, like on the profile, if they have their age?
Well, we have for some of them, but not for all of them. We have for little of them, so we did not chose to include that because we would limit much the data. We also have information on dosage, but this cannot be trusted because they don't have. I don't think these guys have milligram scales to weigh the ketamine, And also we have, that is fun, but we have identity of the users, the experiences they posted a long time. So we know the phases they went through, They had this guy that started with weed, that he had this ketamine phase, then, this more like cocaine phase, this metamine phase. So this is something that could be interesting to look at the subject level, in progression in time, the drugs they explored. We don't have, your question is, we don't have the information. And again, as he said, there's a huge selection bias in this process. These are mostly Westerners, either European or American mostly. Yes.
Question mark.
Yeah, bit of clarification first. So, if I understand correctly, you compare the semantic similarity with binding affinity similarity, and apparently it's really effective at predicting.
Well, 0.6, it's what you got, yeah.
Yeah. So my concern is that the overarching way you present it, I feel like concerned with the explicit focus is related to what Russell said. Focus on that you're relating phenomenology with these molecular interactions or characteristics. But it's more like the cognitive phenomenon, more overarching cognitive states or properties that you're related to the drugs, and that's fine, right?
You say I did not correlate phenomenology.
Yeah, because for example, this whole semantic space is phenomenology is like a small subset there. If you're taking this whole semantic space and correlating that to the molecular interactions, there's no specificity to the phenomenology. The correlations could be to all the other things.
Well, first of all, you are correct in the sense that there were certain words that the fact that the preparation component is there, it's related to contextual information. This is not important and is not really expressed for these molecules because these are synthetic molecules. If you look at this, the components that are mostly relevant for this are the consciousness component, and mostly the body load component is highly important for this. And perhaps ibogaine is an example in which the other are based on contextual information. As you see, that is not phenomenology. I agree that body load is part of the phenomenology. Body load is somatic feelings of, the difference between having a line of cocaine or having or a tab of LSD will mostly be in terms of consciousness versus body load. So these are parts of phenomenology, whether you feel etchy, whether you feel, energetic. So I think that this here is, this is one thing I'm going to say. And so this is not so much contaminated by this component. Then, when we did this analysis, I did not say that. We explicitly went through all the reports. We read all the reports one by one, and we only took the parts of the reports that were speaking about the acute effects of the drugs. So this here is immune to that criticism in the sense that these were really manually curated, we read like 2,000 reports in Neurosciences. I mean, you had to do that. You find some weird shit. So these, we manually selected them. And then there is one other thing, is that recently a colleague in Berlin, Timo Thorsten-Schmidt, published a meta-analysis of questionnaires, including the Altered State of Consciousness questionnaire and so on, for many of these drugs, and that we are not trying to do is we're trying to somehow compare how, if two drugs are similar in terms of the questionnaires, they are also similar in terms of the semantics analysis of the curated narratives. So I think that your concern applies, is more or less, could be more or less important for this part of the thing, even though these molecules in particular will not have a high projection here, if they are mostly in terms of consciousness and body load. It does not appear for this here because we manually curated. We did not even do the censorship automatically. We went through the reports, and finally we want to cross this with the the psychometric scales to validate them or to invalidate them, or to find, basically what we do is complementary to the scales, basically.
We have to stop here because we take a 5 minutes break and then we have a panel discussion, so we can ask questions. Let's thank everyone. So we have 5 minutes and then 15-20 minutes of discussion, and we can go have lunch. J'ai peut-être mettre l'ordinateur côté, on aura plus ça. Tu peux faire un annonce. Otherwise, you can go in this corridor. There is a bathroom. Fountain. No, you can downstairs. You have to mettre là. What? Okay. Yeah. Là, ça va peut-être.
So basically, your concern is so valid that one should actually, what should be doing is reading all the fucking reports in Neurosciences one by one. It's not so much.
Yeah, that's true. No, that's true. Yeah.
It's a pain in the ass, but not so much. So I go to the toilet.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, because I told you those is when I see
Which sense?
I was like really impressed by his way of arguing, presenting, so it was weird, quite very on the same side. No, I mean, we enjoy it. It's fun because he has a style that's French to me. Maybe because he doesn't too much up front or something like that. He was explaining
This entire kind of biology is feeling that the execution is the subject of the research.
sometimes, yeah. There can be,
Your friend is not here today? Psychologist?
No, he has to go back. He has
It was very funny.
yeah, he had like a super funny
Acknowledge the close.
Okay, fine. We're kind of live streaming. Thank God it's not in but, I mean, you pick up by the mic though. Be careful what you say. Okay, well, thank you.
And we have some
Hypothetically, your good friend. It does a report now, right?
So then I know if I have to stay.
Okay.
I will thank you for that.
All right, I think we can start with the discussion so that we can all go have lunch soon. I don't even know if it was Enzo, should we start? Okay, so just an announcement first. So we're going to have a short discussion, panel discussion, because I think it's nice. One of the primary functions of these workshops, I mean, Dr. workshops, is kind of to work together and discuss all these ideas. And there was a nice convergence, I think, in the three talks as well. So it should be fairly convergent. And the other thing is that after that, we're going to go have lunch. We can all have lunch. Whoever wants to join can join. And we're probably going to go to the Place de la Princesse Cap nearby. And you're very welcome to join for lunch after that if you make it to the end of the discussion. Okay, so I think unless if you have questions for each other, we could question as well. But I think first we can start with the questions.
Well, thank you guys for the talk. I got an epistemological question for all of you, because like all of you are like using those heroin website and natural language processing. And I already knew those stuff, but listening to you, I'm asking myself, like, can we like really legitimately consider those data as phenomenological data? Because like from my point of view, it's more like giving some kind of sociological data about like a kind of sociological snapshot about like all people in that period of time in that society have the ability to talk about that kind of experience.
So I want to answer that. It's an excellent question. These methods we are using, I'm not really, I mean, when somebody comes up with psychometric scale, it involves lots of validation. These methods have not been validated in the same way. So what I was saying at the end is that one thing to do this is to go to these reports and try to see if the information we can extract from them really matches, for example, the psychometric scales in a certain way. That would imply that there could be all this sociological information there, but also besides that, information that is relevant for the phenomenology. And this is work that we plan to do. We should validate them in the sense we mean.
Yeah, and if we have in the future, as this project of having a successor to Aurora, right? One thing I've discussed, for example, with Matthieu is to have, and Timo actually, is to link this to also the questionnaires. So, for example, someone could have a free trip report, right? And then the same person fill the standardized questionnaire, and you can see how well this could converge. Right?
Yes, because the kind of work I want to do to link them is on a different population of subjects. Right. But having the same subject doing the narrative is exactly what would let us do this the proper way.
But I guess also one could ask whether, when you do field work in anthropology or something, you're also getting descriptions, right, from people, so you have the same issue, right? So, but I guess your reply would be that you're more aware of these kind of...
The fact is that you are considering the fact that when people talk about their experience, you learn less about the experience than the way people talk about their experience.
Right.
And with my phenomenological interview, I guess it's good try at least to really try to go deep inside of phenomenology. But again, if you work with people, like for instance, I was talking about microphenomenology like 2 days ago with anthropologists working in Himalayan in India, and they were saying, well, fascinating, but we are working with people who haven't like any taste for introspection. So if you try to do that stuff, they will just say, I don't know, like, just leave me alone with your question. Like. Right. So, but that's another point. But
right. There's one more point, so I want to make a distinction that maybe we not emphasize. The distinction between using narratives as acute effects of the drug versus retrospective effects. Retrospective effects, they are the writing style of the person, where the person fancies himself or herself a poet, would change the way it's reported. In the acute effects, you can get these more low-level markers like disorganized speech and entropy of how the transition between words, and these things are even more, I think, related to phenomenology, but you need someone to report during the acute effects. Retrospective are more affected by these things that you mentioned.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that, how do you perceive that people should report on the acute effects? Because that's like highly problematic in the way we've done this in the past. And it's when someone's like intensity rating of 70, just 9 or 10, they're not really able to talk anyway. So
which drug?
So the DMT. Just for example, because the DMT study, when people have rated up to the rate group, they can say 10, but if you ask them to interrogate, tell me the phenomenology experience.
Well, maybe that's narrative. The narrative is say someone's only being able to say 10. No, as a show.
Well, it's dose-dependent issue.
Yeah.
I mean, it really depends on what sort of experience do you want to push with the dose. The portability of it can fall out when it's very intense.
Yeah, ketamine as well. Ketamine, if you go to the keyhole, you won't be able to speak, but short of the keyhole, you can have someone
So
talk.
do you think it's worthwhile doing maybe lower dose studies where perhaps without the trappings of neuroimaging, you spend more time trying to interrogate people during the experience, maybe with something like LSD or something?
I think so.
It would be interesting. Tell me what's
I think
at threshold is also where the interesting thing happens. I mean, if it is about
and they are introducing the LSD experiment, they never come when the people were still at the plateau, and in between the psychometric scale, what in the imperial protocol got unstructured interviews with people.
I think so.
Well, the data.
I think there's some data on it. Yeah.
The data is the one that we introduce them.
I think it would be really interesting to have studies that maybe don't focus at all on neuroimaging and only focus on phenomenology. It's more difficult to get funding and so on and to publish because people are skeptical.
But then it's also cheaper.
It's also much cheaper, and you can do it ecologically, so you can actually, in some case, if you want to have a different setting, you can go somewhere else. And then you can do a live microphonological interview with someone on a medium or low dose or something, and really probe into the effects as they're feeling them. I think that would be really interesting.
I think there's also something to be said about the fact that you can make an argument for the fact that you're not reporting adequately while you're having the experience because of different levels not being integrated.
But the problem is that the acute effects, and this is the papers I want to show you, it becomes less relevant in semantics. So it becomes more relevant like something like, for example, Siddhartha Ribeiro, he creates speech graphs. Speech graph is basically a graph in which a node is a word, regardless of its semantic content, and you connect them if they follow each other in the discourse. So normally you get these people, you and I, you have a certain structure of the graph. When you go to someone who is under psychotic outbreak, they have all these loops and weird, shambled around. So if you depart from semantics, I think that, true what you say, in the level of semantics, not in the level of the discourse itself. Yeah.
Or you can see that dysfunction happening at the level of the structure of the sentencing.
Of course.
Like you're saying, the thing is that are you tapping into a dysfunction or are you tapping into a proper phenomenal quality of it? And I think that's kind of also a discussion about online reporting versus retrospective reporting, and while microphenomenology still holds in that context, I would say. So either lowering the level of the dose and to just keep it at threshold. I mean, if it is about how do these perturbations of consciousness can tell us more about consciousness, it's about that slight departure, right, in a way as well. So I think that's also worth exploring. I think Chris, you had a...
Yeah, so this is for Christopher and for Enzo. So what if we talk about the role of priors and about controlling for things like metabolization? I think Christopher mentioned priors, try to figure out whether you can use this methodology to say probe for determinism or metaphysical beliefs and ideals and so on. So what about the role of, say, controlling for the difference between semantic and episodic memory, for instance? Because a lot of this reporting, there is a lot of interference in semantic memory from episodic memory from semantic memory because of the vocabulary that's required to access that experience. So how do you control for that?
Yeah, you can't. Basically, we have to as good as it gets. I talked with David Nichols, and he said that with Sasha Schulz in his book, after he publishes the synthesis of the molecules, what he used to do is he took themselves the molecules, he increased his dose, and when he found some effects, he gathered a group of friends, he told them what effects were, and they took them all together, and then the reports, there are very short reports, are published in his books. So what David Nichols told me, these people had such respect for Sasha Schulz in that if Sasha came with a drug and said that the drug will turn the sun into green color, all the people there would take the drug and see the sun turning green. The problem is that most of these people in Neurosciences, many of them have read the books by Sasha Schulz, so there is an expectation effect. How can we deal with that? Well, it's difficult because many of your subjects have already read Strassman's book. Yeah. So it's embedded into culture. We will need to go to not drug naive subjects. We will need to go to a drug naive culture. We will need to go to a place where people I don't know, South Korea maybe.
North Korea.
North Korea. I don't think many people in North Korea have read Tikal or Inserm's book. And that is the kind of, you see the point, it's embedded in culture, so even if you do a placebo-controlled study, you can't get rid of that. You know, the idea that DMT is like a near-death experience is embedded because Rick already screwed it up, and everybody believes that, and it's a problem.
But this, I mean, that's definitely a point that ultimately we cannot completely get around unless we do these culture control trials, right? Even though I do have to say that the memes that are happening at the high order aspects of experience, especially around figurative, doesn't seem to be that obvious. The ways that we can try to control this, at least in the studies, is around priming. How do you prepare subjects before the sessions?
There is one more way. Sorry.
So that, and also microphenomenology kind of like tries to attempt to prevent that from happening by using specific. So the way that they conceptualize it, like, and how Piver initially thought about it, is like you really try to get the person in a state in which they're not filling in their experience with reflective content and semantic stuff, and there is like something about pausing and like letting them go back to it somehow.
There is one way out, which is obvious. That is, we come up with new drugs that nobody ever tried. This is, this is what Sasha was doing all the time, but he didn't. Then he was all about being open, you know. But we could go down Sasha's path and come up with drugs.
People would relate them to other drugs, I think.
No, if I give you a drug, I don't tell you whatever it is. I don't tell you the name. I don't give you the chemical formula. I don't tell you anything about it.
Yeah, but you still say, oh, it feels like a breakthrough, or it feels like people do these cross-drug comparisons all the time.
Could be, but if it's really, if I give you scopolamine and then I really screw you up, then you can't compare. But we go into unethical territory then.
But I think just to follow up very quickly on your point about the drug-naive culture, I think actually this used to be the case. We have studies from the 50s and from the 40s, even from the first mescaline studies from the 30s done by psychiatrists trying to have a model of psychosis that are from a drug-naive culture where people had no idea. There was no psychonautics community, there was no Sacha-Shulgin, there was nothing, no Timothy Leary. And if you look at the effects reported, actually, I mean, I'm most interested, when I'm looking into these effects, what I'm most interested in personally is effects on self-consciousness, because that's what I study primarily, right? And if you look at these effects, they're already reported in the 30s, in the German studies, and in the 40s, and in pretty similar terms, actually. So that's also one way to control is look at what people are reporting as a completely drug-naive and in a drug-naive culture.
Yes, you have to read an essay that's called Visions of the Night by Dan Perrine. This is the one I sent you. It describes the first known Westerns who came across peyote. They were completely drug naive to psychedelics in general. So the first one basically thought that he was dying, you know. The second one was expecting a high like whiskey. So he said, you know, I kept vomiting. I did not feeling like I couldn't get drunk. I had these funny side effects like I close visuals. For him, the geometric patterns were unpleasant side effects because he was expecting getting drunk. And finally, there is the final one who spent a long time living among the Huichol, and he participated in the ceremonies and so on. And he describes more like an integrated. The essay is called Visions of the Night by Daniel Perrine, and it's a really, really readable essay on the first encounters on the Westerns, which were drug naive with peyote.
Yes, Marco.
Yeah, so regarding to priors, maybe one other way to get out of it, in addition to looking at drug-naive cultures, is looking at the degree of sensitivity in either direction to priors or biases. We could look at different domains of the experience, like sensory domains or narrative structures or visual percepts, and just see to what extent they are sensitive to that priming. And I think that might be a particularly interesting way to look at the phenomenal structure, because the psychedelic experience is sensitive in many different domains. It's characteristically very visual, of course, and very physical. Some are more narrative-like, some are less narrative-like. Some are very emotional, some are less emotional. And maybe that's a good way to use it exactly because people are sensitive to biases. Because, you know, it's grounded
in a critical coding sense in generative models. So maybe it's a way to look at how plastic or manipulatable those models.
Well, one of the strongest predictors of experiences, personality variables, is this trait of absorption. Mm-hmm. And I think that relates very much to permeability on adopting, contextual priors that may happen in an ayahuasca session, for example, and the contents happening in there. I think those are testable things, also meditation.
Okay, so my question is for mainly Raphael. So I have a worry about the possibility of finding mapping from a global neural state to global neural activity or global neural state.
Yeah.
So to see my point, let me consider the mapping from specific content of experience to the brain area responsible for that, kind of specific content of experience of seeing redness, for example. In order to find the mapping from experience of seeing redness to the brain area responsible for that, we need to collect data from a lot of many subjects or people who can be regarded as having the same experience, the experience of seeing redness. So otherwise, we cannot find the mapping in a reliable manner. But in the case of seeing redness, it's not so difficult to control the experimental conditions in such a way that we are sure that the subject have the experience of seeing redness. Right? It's not so difficult to make such a condition, experimental condition. But in the case of global phenomenal state, it's defined in very sophisticated manner and a very kind of detailed manner, so that it seems to me that it's very difficult to control experimental conditions in such a way that the subject have the same, the subject are in the same global phenomenal state.
Yeah.
So because of that, it seems to me that it's quite difficult to find a mapping from a specific global phenomenal state to the global neural activity. So how to deal with this problem?
Yeah, so just very quickly, this is a very good point, but two things on this. The first is that the reason why we need to look at many subjects experiencing red when we want to have correlations with what's happening in the brains is precisely to control for everything else that's happening to them, right? If you want to get a correlation between the global phenomenal state of someone and, let's say, global brain state, I mean, it's not going to be very informative because you want the specific neural correlates, but let's just say for the sake of simplicity. You just need to look at what's happening in the brain of someone at time t and have a description of what they're experiencing at time t, right? But because you're not looking for specific contents, you don't need to have this kind of look across many different subjects because you're not trying to isolate a specific conscious content, right? So the very reason why you need to do that in the case of specific content in the first place is because you're looking at specific contents against the background of many other things. If you're looking for a snapshot of the global phenomenal state, that's not so much of an issue. The other thing is that you can, when you do neuroimaging studies, such as psychedelic studies, you can try to look not just for one global phenomenal state, but for a region, right? A region that's maybe, in this case, probably a foreign region of this phenomenal state space that's not usually inhabited or by subjects, right? So to speak, speaking metaphors, but you see what I mean. So of course you're not going to have. I mean, the subjects in the DMT study, they don't all have the same exact type of experience, right? But if you look at it in more to the region of states they can be in, and also if you look at it at a sufficiently large level of granularity, there is a vast amount of overlap. So they tend to. I mean, we showed a little bit the general structure in terms of bodily, visual, emotional aspects. You can kind of explore these kind of larger scale correlations. Right. But yeah, take a point. Yeah.
I would like a question. Sorry, maybe it's not time yet for us to speak. I just wanted to question, because I don't have had the opportunity of meeting philosophers close, and to question that the concept of the neural correlates of consciousness makes sense. they have been defined by Christoph Koch and Francis Crick as a minimum set of neuron events that are required for a certain. But is it true? I mean, how can you assume that first of all, if you find a certain neurons or a process, whether it will be the same across person or even worse, when you expose a person to the color red, the neural correlates will be the same when you expose the person to the second time the color red. So the neural correlates might exist, but it would be like, Heraclitus River, that every time you go into it is different. This has not been discussed, that the neural correlates might not exist in the way we think they exist. It's something that troubles me, and I have not seen, Alba Noé has a paper on that, but I haven't really seen.
I mean, there's a huge literature on that, and I think there are many
maybe
different.
There's
a good paper by Dave Chalmers on that, but there are many different notions of neural correlates, right? Because you have neural correlates of specific contents, you have neural correlates of phenomenality per se, right? But at the minimally sufficient neural structure for any kind of conscious state to be there at all, right? So, and you have to be very careful distinguishing between the enabling conditions and then the minimally sufficient conditions that are not part of. Yeah, exactly. So all of these, I mean, my talk wasn't on that specifically, and I have never delved in depth into this literature, but there is a huge literature on that, and I agree that these are.
I have a concern because we know all these new studies of no report paradigms.
Yeah.
The network involving consciousness used to be frontoparietal and temporal. And as people start to distinguish, report, working memory starts to shrink to a clot, and I'm afraid that it will disappear entirely when people realize the similar point that maybe
Chris and I were at the ASSC and there was this whole debate.
Maybe
is consciousness in the front or is it in the back of the brain?
True, it's in this hotspot here, but it's shrinking. It's not getting larger.
You have the higher order people like Hop and Lau and Rosenthal think it's in the front. It's prefrontal cortex. I mean, that you have this never-ending debate between the autonomy people.
I've known people with the frontal cortex from birth that are very conscious.
Yeah. I mean, that's but they haven't.
And I've known people who they took the precuneus out of because of associated epilepsy and they were not conscious. Were still conscious. But maybe the correlate is not in the region itself, but in how many cables you cut between the regions.
Yeah,
so on the white matter and not in the grey matter.
Or maybe, yeah.
I think that's a hypothesis.
Or in how the system has, adapted according to its history. So you get another mental perspective on
But then it's as difficult to study consciousness, and in the same way that's as difficult as study evolutionary theory, in the sense that you can only get this very laws that relate to. We don't know why giraffes have we know why, but we don't know at what moment the mutation. So probably you have some control. And the same happens for personal history. Your personal history is so difficult to map to the person you are now that again, if the neural correlates depend on that, we are screwed.
We may be screwed. I don't know.
So I have time for one final question. So, Matthieu,
Yes, I was inspired by the way that you present some hierarchical structure about the phenomenal properties of consciousness. I was wondering for example, when you labeled emotion, cognitive, and different aspects, whether it was based on already a clustering which is like, for example, using PCA that you don't define the number of categories and how you see the ability from just the reports to get out the structure of.
So that's something I haven't talked about and I haven't been doing yet, but I think what would be interesting, for example, if you take from the concept clouds of the drug of the average state produced by different drugs, you could then try to. It would have to be hand coded, unfortunately, I think, because there is no this data about structure is not salient for a machine learning model from the description themselves. But you have to hand code, the determinable determinates relations between different words, right? So red is a determinant of color is a determinant of visual, and so on. And then if you hand code, I think it would be doable because if you take the main words that appear in these concept clouds, it would be maybe a lexicon of maybe 1,000 words, even maybe you could live with less words maybe. So you can get a few people working on this and doing this relation, then you can have a nice hierarchical thing where you could look at the different layers of the tree and see how different drugs compare. And different building blocks get shared across different drugs. I think it's doable. I mean, and I'm just talking about drugs, you could do it with other states.
Just quickly on that, in genetics, this has been a big problem for mapping. Well, the advantage of geneticists is that they have the layer is genes.
Right.
But to map out the degeneracy of how many genes are implicated in a specific molecular function or in a cell compartment, etc., they have developed a consortium to map all the ontology of conceptual items they wanted to, and they created something called gene ontology, but it's not a tree, that's a graph.
Right.
It's a hierarchical graph.
That's what I want to say.
Yeah.
And that's something I have to think about.
And there is like statistical methods then to map in a slice of this graph enrichment of molecular functions. For instance, if you have a given number of genes that are associated with the disease, you can then look at how many molecular functions relate to these genes compared to randomness. And that could be applied to
I'd love to hear more about
this. Because the tree structure, I started to thinking when you show the trees, what happens if you have a link at the same level, what would that mean? Or maybe more like on a structure graph, how could that map to the interpretation of the neuronal space? And then I started wondering all these things, what sense could we make of more general graph structure? Because I thought it was very nice how you represented things, and then I started thinking of more complex structures.
I mean, the link to the same layer would be, I think, ground regulations, what we're discussing earlier, right? So maybe emotional phenomenology is just a combination of cognitive and cognitive phenomenology, and so then you have this. But my simplified model was showing only phenomenal primitives.
No, of course.
So the things that cannot be further, that are not further grounded at a level in the combination of other.
Yeah, but you're assuming those are basically the initial. That's how the word qualia came into being. Qualia was not to use the quality description. It came into being to describe an atom of thoughts, of conscious thought. So basically, your rules are basically the qualias. But that's where my question came of how many of them. Because if there are as many as natural numbers, it's fine. If there are as many as real numbers, the graph cannot be exist.
I take a top-down approach, so I want to be agnostic about the others.
At some point, you see, at some point, then cuts and the primitives might not even make sense of.
By primitive, I don't mean the bottom layer. I mean at each layer, phenomenal properties that are not grounded in a combination of other. I mean, this is critical.
Do you think there is a bottom layer? What are your thoughts on the bottom layer?
I don't know.
Words. Words, single words or letters. I mean, language would be the bottom layer of reportability.
What you're saying is that
in terms of phenomenal properties.
What I'm saying is that don't go Terence McKenna on me saying that the only mind is language, because
that's a nice.
He's very persuasive, but then you start thinking a little bit, and this guy played a trick on me.
That's a nice way to conclude, I think, the workshop. So thanks everyone for coming, and maybe we can say a few words about ALIUS to conclude, just that you all presumably know about our organization, our group, but you can find us on aliusresearch.org. We have an annual bulletin that comes out with interviews with prominent researchers working on consciousness in general, and specifically altered states of consciousness. The next issue should come around, hopefully in February. It's a bit late, but and we have an open call for interviews for the ALIUS members that are here today. So we're come forward with propositions of interviews. What else? We might soon have a podcast, but that's still in the works, right? We have a blog that's not super active, but
But how can we make it adaptive? I mean, is it possible? Because I'm new. Is it possible, to propose a blog entry? That
absolutely. You're extremely welcome. We're always looking for.
And it's not like I'm going to. The idea is not that people send random chunk, but
explaining your current research or
other people reviews, makes comment, edits, and then it goes through.
No, absolutely.
I would love, because I write a lot. I really write a lot. I mean, write too
so
much. And I don't know what to do with what I write.
There you go.
But I don't want to be the only one doing that.
No, but all the people have been doing. We used to have featured ALIUS researchers every month.
Yeah.
But people were too busy. People were too busy. But anyways. So find us on online. We have a Facebook page. We don't have a Twitter account yet, but maybe someday. Guillaume. Thanks again. And now we can go for lunch. But yeah.